Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another review of the latest Traitors US season. Here I'll be talking about my thoughts on the Traitors Season 3, a season that I thought was a really fun ride. I mean, in comparison to the previous US seasons, I think it is probably my favorite of the bunch, with again just so much chaos happening on this season throughout the majority of it. So much dissension within the Traitors themselves that made this season feel very unique. I feel like we have not seen this much open animosity between the Traitors and seeing them actually go after each other, to where, again, I think that aspect of the season was really interesting. Also, there were some massive names on the season, to where, while, again, there were points where the boot list was kind of disappointing, I do feel like, as a whole, this season really stood out to me as one of my personal favorites. I think it had so many incredible moments along the way, to where, again, I think it's actually amongst one of the best Traitors season globally, not just within the US, to where, again, overall, I thought this was a really great season. But to talk about the reasons why, I'll be running through this season, episode by episode, talking about my thoughts along the way. And with that, let's start off with episode 1, which always starts with the players being driven to the castle, getting brief intros to the cast here. From Dorinda saying that she's going to be the queen of this castle, which ends up being kind of ironic. All Sam gets to talk about being married to Britney Spears, because that's the only notable thing about him. But we do actually primarily focus a lot on the social strategy alumni here, which was nice to see, especially as, again, obviously I am someone that am almost exclusively a fan of those sort of shows, where we finally get a lot of focus on the Brittany-Danielle dynamic, coming straight from Big Brother Reindeer games, with Danielle getting very emotional when seeing Brittany, and we see them seemingly talk it out, which again is really funny to see this level of heartbreak coming from Reindeer games of all seasons. And again, just insane that Big Brother Reindeer games actually played a factor into the Traitors. But also here we do get some focus on the Tony and Jeremy dynamic, with them having a really fun reunion here, and them both being ecstatic to see each other, where I know a lot of people were coming into this season thinking that they were going to be on bad terms after Tony blindsided Jeremy and Survivor Winners at War, though again, I thought it was pretty apparent they had patched things up since then. And it did seem like this is a relationship being set up to be this long-term storyline, only for it to obviously be cut short, which was, again, very disappointing from my point of view. But also we get lots of talk about how big of a threat Tony is. First from Carolyn, which, again, I wonder if this is set up to a certain dilemma that won't end up mattering. But again, we do end up getting a lot of strategic content here from Carolyn, which made her a major frontrunner from the offset, along with also seeing Dylan Efron, Zac Efron's brother, having similar thoughts about Tony, with him also getting a pretty decent intro here, talking about being an underdog. And again, amongst these reality TV legends, though, he does end up coming off pretty perceptive here, with him very much coming off as the Pilot Pete of the season, this person that is surprisingly good, despite seeming like a dud in the preseason. But eventually Alan ends up arriving on horseback, giving us our first twist of the season, with us getting the reveal of an extra player that can enter the game. That is, if a current player ends up shaking Alan's hand, where at that point they'll be allowed to eliminate one of their fellow players, and in doing so allow this new player to take their spot. That player being revealed to be Boston Rob, which, again, I know Rob himself has said in his exit press that even he thought this was a terrible twist, and yeah, it was kind of a terrible twist, where again, the show tries to make it seem like Carolyn was genuinely thinking about making the move to take out Tony here, but it would make absolutely no sense for her, but really for anybody, to be making this move in this spot. It really just puts this massive bullseye on your back, especially when you're swapping out a person on this cast for Boston Rob of all people, where again, taking out Tony to put in Boston Rob is not much of a difference there. So again, it would make no sense for the players themselves to be doing this, and again, I have to think the producers knew that, right? And also, all this is just a very weird setup, considering the fact that you obviously know they're not going to just completely waste Rob in this position. It's not like if no one stepped up to pick Rob, which again was very unlikely, that we're going to literally just send Rob home. Again, one of the biggest names in reality TV show history. Or again, all this kind of just felt like a facade, and even then, again, the players themselves fully should have known that Rob was going to come back into the game in some sort of fashion. That is, if anyone actually knew who he was, considering we actually do see a good chunk of this cast not know who Boston Rob is. We're just kind of insane that, considering what the casting style is of the Traitors, you would think a lot more of these non-social strategy players would be doing their research into some of these bigger legends of the game. But a funny reaction we did get here was from Bob the Drag Queen, who instantly comes off as a really incredible character, but ends up proceeding to talk about how he doesn't like his hat and his shoes, which, Bob the Drag Queen's disapproval of Boston Rob's wardrobe ends up being a funny reoccurrence across the season. And I did love them having Rob record an annoyed confessional about how they prejudged him and how bullshit this is. despite the fact that he clearly knows that he's going to be brought back into the game in some sort of fashion. But following this, we obviously get the players entering the castle and getting to know each other, during which we do get some content from Tony here, where he tells the group that he wants to be a faithful, only for Carolyn to call bullshit, with Tony being annoyed, obviously, and calling her a liability. And while I do think that this is inherently bad play from Carolyn, again, just calling out Tony for no reason here, I do think it is these genuine moments from Carolyn here that do lead to her being really effective as a traitor, where people just see her as this very reactionary and seemingly emotional player. Where again, I think a lot of people just genuinely didn't believe the fact that Carolyn could even be a traitor, which is again funny, as this is essentially just what happened to her on Survivor, though again, Moses Cass has clearly not seen that. Anyway, we get to the selection, where we get to see Alan interviewing each of the players, leading to some fun moments here, from like Carolyn wanting to be a traitor and Alan saying don't beg, only for us to cut to Tony begging, which is again typical fare there. Plus, we also get a great one-liner here from Alan after talking to Tom Sandoval, who says that he wants to be a faithful and that if he's picked, he would feel betrayed, only for Alan to say that it doesn't feel nice, does it? Anyway, we end up seeing Danielle, Carolyn, and Bob the Drag Queen getting picked to be the traitors here, which I thought were really great picks, to where while they did come into this season actually wanting to mess with the meta and not choose any social strategy players, I would have been very remiss if they did cast Danielle Reyes and not make her a traitor somehow, which again just felt like a perfect role for her until it wasn't, I guess. But also Carolyn ends up being a really inspired pick here, where again no one seems to pick up on her. Oh well, Bob the Drag Queen, despite again being someone that I personally was not familiar with coming into this season, ends up being a really fun presence both in confessional and in the game itself, to where these end up being the perfect traitor choices in this spot. But it's here where we also get the reveal that the game has changed, that those in the final will not reveal whether they're a traitor or not, to where the other players will have to rely on their instincts, which again they've been doing a lot of in recent versions of the show. Again, Traitors UK Season 3 obviously did this. Again, Traitors Canada has done this. And I do think this is an interesting modification to the game. It is one that obviously incentivizes more cutthroat gameplay from the Faithfuls, as obviously kind of forces you to go down the two, as you don't know the roles of those around you and if you got that last traitor out. And while I do get the criticism of this and how it now makes the final choices during the final fire pointless, as everyone's just going to vote out anyway, again, I personally don't mind that change. As well, obviously the traitors have a massive advantage throughout the majority of the game, I do think the traitors can have a disadvantage during the final fire if the roles are revealed, as we saw in Traitors New Zealand Season 1. This is a twist for me that, again, I just only see as a positive, as again, it incentivizes the Faithfuls to be more cutthroat, but it also incentivizes the traitors to have to really think about final two situations. And again, I just think in general that makes the game more interesting from my point of view. But following this, we do get some pretty fun content from Tom, who instantly tries to play this like big detective here, sussing out Chriselle because she changed after the round table, I guess, aka him just not feeling good about her because she is a friend of his ex's, which again just furthers the bullseye on Tom's back, all while we get to see Tony really latch on to this plan, with Tony talking about needing to point fingers, considering the target on his back, which I don't think was the right call for him. Now, again, at the end of the day, Tony's probably screwed anyway, and he might as well go out guns blazing. But again, this ends up really feeling pretty similar to what happened to him on Survivor Game Changers, and him just feeling like he knew he had a target on his back and he might as well go all out. But in doing so, he just makes the bullseye on his back even that much more apparent. And while it did seem to be working for, again, the first couple episodes, it ultimately does lead to him going out in a way that, hey, I just felt like this strategy was never going to work, and almost everyone's just kind of willing to let him go by that point. But also here, we do get a segment specifically surrounding Carolyn about people underestimating her, with Jeremy talking about how she can't be a traitor, as they would sniff it out in a second, and Tom saying that he would have thought she was a traitor if she wasn't always so twitchy, which again just shows Carolyn's natural personality, giving her a massive advantage here in this spot. Where again, I don't know how much of what Carolyn does is purposeful, considering a lot of that just feels like it's based around her natural ability, though again, it is still very effective in this game, especially in terms of avoiding sus and surviving pretty deep into the game. Anyway, we end up getting to our first mission, a repeat of a challenge used in the UK, which I feel like we did see less of on this season, is like recycled challenges. But again, this one was one where you had to row a boat across a river, and along the way you had to sacrifice players to get money or get fuel to burn the ring of fire at the end, where The people that make it to the end end up winning a shield. And in general, I really like this challenge. Again, add these massive stakes to this challenge. And with every decision you are making, you are essentially forcing people to volunteer to not get a shield during the first ever murder. Again, a very scary situation to be put in. So again, I thought the dynamics displayed here in this challenge was really interesting. Also, again, a little ickiness at points with the men clearly being unwilling to drop out, and like Ivar saying that we need strong guys, which again, not a good look for him. Though again, it was nice to see Bob the Drag Queen fighting back here against this, though really it doesn't end up doing much, where most of the people that drop out still end up being women. First of which being all the housewives, further highlight how strategic aloof they are in the game, where they are now all not safe and also become sus for not being scared of becoming vulnerable. And again, it does lead to a little funny moment of them communicating between the pontoons and coming to this realization that they're probably going to be targets now. But then we do end up seeing Bob the Drag Queen and Danielle dropping out, with Danielle doing her typical over-the-top acting that she does across a lot of the season. But it does end up leading to a really funny moment here between Bob and Danielle of them talking about who they think the traitors are, unknowingly being two of the three traitors in this spot. But then we do end up seeing Bob H and Sam volunteer because some men finally decide to do something. It does end up leading to a Sam confessional, his only confessional to episode 7. But ultimately, no one sacrifices themselves at the final choice here, which would have gotten them more money at the end, which ends up leading to further frustrations from those that did sacrifice themselves, along the fact that we also see those on the pontoons being stranded in the cold for a while longer than the others, and returning after the others have already eaten up a good chunk of the food, which does lead to some fun drama here from Dorinda, as again you would expect from a housewife, and her confronting the others and getting into a tiff with Ivar, with there seeming to be some sus on Dorinda at this point over her being a traitor, which again makes you question the traitor's upcoming decision. But so it was nice for Dorinda to at least get one moment on the show here. Either way, we do get to nighttime where we see the traitors taking the traitor's oath, and we get a fun moment here from Danielle and Bob when they first see each other, with both seemingly believing each other as faithfuls, though in general they did end up seeming pretty close in the game here, ending up being ride or dies during the short stint that Bob the Drag Queen had, which again would have been a very fun alliance to see play out here, though obviously it gets a bit cut short. But either way, Carolyn obviously ends up joining as well, to which they're obviously shocked at that. Though again, I think Carolyn very clearly felt like an outlier in this initial turret, with Bob and Danielle being more in lockstep with Carolyn just kind of being left out, which is kind of typical for Carolyn. Anyway, the episode ends in a pretty unique way here, where we don't even get the decision being made yet. Instead, we go back to Alan, saying that every choice has consequences, and that the players unknowingly change the course of the game by cruelly ejecting Rob, with the reveal that Rob will be entering the game as a traitor. And they really end up hyping this up as like Rob getting payback, which again really feels like the purpose of that initial twist, even though again I feel like that's kind of dumb. But we do end up seeing that Rob will be entering the game alongside 2 fellow players, all of which being placed inside of a cage, which will become the next episode's mission, to which we end the episode for even getting to see who the late entrants are, to where we get to episode 2, and what a shocker, it's Derek and Wes. Or again, this was spoiled beforehand, but either way, both obviously legends of their respective shows. Makes sense that they were added here alongside Rob. Now again, would have been nice if it wasn't just 3 men being added to the game very late, and also it feels like this is kind of a twist added in to keep these like bigger names around for at least the round of the game. But again, all 3 end up having immunity through the first round, but in turn, this twist also ends up becoming a negative for them down the road, obviously putting a target on their backs, as again, there ends up being this just common assumption that one of these 3 are likely to be a traitor, where again, I think I personally would have just assumed it had to be Rob, as why else was Rob the one that was explicitly shown to us back in the opening and was treated differently? But again, it seems like no one ever really thought of that. And I will say, in general, I never loved the idea of like adding players in late to something like the Traitors, as again, I feel like that meta aspect of the game is always going to play a factor there. Anyway, after that, we do finally cut to the turret, where we already see friction between Danielle and Carolyn, which again, might not be the only time we see that friction. But again, we end up seeing them wanting to murder a housewife, which again is probably the right call because of the numbers, though I could see also a world where keeping around the housewives is keeping around this big shield for them. But again, here we do have seeing Danielle wanting to murder Dorinda for some reason, not really explained. And also, again, very strange considering the fact that Dorinda, again, had sus on her. But I guess it's not a guarantee that Danielle knows that. But again, this is all while Carolyn wants to kill Robin. Only for that to go nowhere because it's Carolyn. Where, again, like on Survivor, she really just seems to have this issue at like exerting her influence, where again, I think she is a player that is very good strategically. I think she actually does come up with the correct strategic calls at most given situations. The problem is that she's never able to get other people to go along with those calls. And I feel like the Traitors kind of exemplified that once again here, just showing her very rarely getting her way and almost always being on the opposite side of what ultimately ends up being done here, and they ultimately end up landing on Dorinda here, seemingly in an attempt to frame Ivar, which is funny as it kind of goes nowhere. But anyway, again, we lose Dorinda. It's a shame. Again, I think Dorinda had potential to be a great character. I know Dorinda's, again, one of the biggest names in the Real Housewives franchise, where, again, the fact that she kind of gets sniped at the very beginning here, really only after providing that one moment of her fighting Ivar, is, again, a shame. I think, again, there would have been a lot of potential seeing her at a round table, her calling out people. That would have been very fun, but obviously we didn't get to see it. But with that, we then cut to breakfast, where we do get some humor here from Tony, just instantly trying to throw Dorinda under the bus, all while we see Ayan being the only housewife to enter before the end, with housewives clearly being targeted here, though we do get a kind of humorous confessional from Ayan in retrospect of her being excited to survive, as her son told her that she would die fast, which, again, that's a shame. Also, we do end up getting set up to Wells being close to Ayan, which weirdly doesn't end up mattering, so I don't know why this was here, outside just highlighting the two boots for the episode. But this does also transition to Robin thinking that it is Wells, because he changed after the Traitors were selected, I guess. Again, this leads to a really weird confrontation where Robin talks about like how smart of a move it was to take out Dorinda, with Wells disagreeing and again, speaking sense here and saying like, why would you kill somebody that was already being targeted? Though at the same time, this does actually lead him into the wrong direction, with him actually now targeting Robin. Again, thinking that it's weird that she would compliment a traitor's move, which also it's like, again, if she was a traitor, why would she do that? Why would any traitor do that? But again, it really ultimately has like both going after each other in a spot where it really makes no sense for either of them to be doing so. But along with this, we do also end up seeing Danielle throwing the housewives under the bus, talking about it has to be one of them having murdered one of their own to keep their cover, which again, makes sense if the housewives had a strategic bone in their bodies. But again, we do see Danielle pulling in Dylan here, who ends up seemingly believing her. And Dylan in general here, I do think does a very good job at having a working relationship with most of the gamers in the house, to where, again, I think that is probably the optimal strat. And again, I don't know how intentional Dylan was necessarily doing this, but again, we've seen already, obviously, that the gamers are very likely to be picked as traitors. And through that, if you build a working relationship with the gamers, more than likely, they're going to keep you alive because they think they have you in their back pocket. But anyway, we do get to the mission where they end up seeing 3 cages. And initially, I did think that, are they going to do the exact same thing they did in the UK? Where, again, that was a twist where, again, 3 people were eliminated on day 1, and they brought those 3 people back for this cage challenge, where, again, they also had, like, people scrambling around to get coins, and you would put the coin in the tube of one of the cage players, and as they get more coins, their cage drops. In the UK, the first 2 to drop end up being the ones to rejoin the game, with the 3rd person being formally eliminated. I was kind of worried to a degree they were going to do a similar thing here. Though, again, same philosophy, though, as the previous Rob thing, is that, again, they're not going to waste Rob, Derek, and Wes on this twist, where, again, even if they did go home to some degree, I would not have faith in them staying gone. But I did think that they were going to do something similar to that, though they end up actually modifying it here. I'll make it a guarantee that all 3 are going to enter, obviously, but now make these choices on whose coins you put your tube in relate to the shields, where, again, if a player's cage gets to the bottom, that respective player will not have a shield to give away by the end of the night, which, again, I thought was a very interesting dynamic to see added here. Well, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, as all 3 of them end up getting to the bottom anyway. I did like the fact that, again, they're adding more of these social strategy aspects to the challenges themselves, and we do interesting to see most people going for Rob here first. But again, here we end up seeing Dylan, again, talking about wanting to work with Rob, with him essentially becoming a blindly loyal ally to Rob during his stint on this season. All while we see Tom going for Derek, which I believe it's been revealed that, like, Tom and Derek knew each other before the season, which, again, that's very random. All while Wes is the last to be dropped, as he has very few allies here, where I guess supposedly he knew Wells from before the season, but really outside that, there were no challenge alumni on this season, which is a very shocking thing, but also something that, again, just made him a massive outlier here. But again, they all end up finishing, as you would expect, especially as, again, obviously producers would want these shields in play, to where again, no real suspense in how the challenge plays out. But with that, we also get some setup here on Derek's relationship with Danielle Reyes, which, again, I actually did not know how close they seemed to be coming into this season, where, again, I suspected they were cordial and they definitely had met at points, but I did not realize that they seem to be genuine friends here, with and her fully expecting Derek to give her the shield, again, telling him that she's worried that they would try to kill her to frame Brittany, which was a decent pitch there from Danielle, which, again, I'm sure will work out for her. Anyway, we then get to the round table, which it really did feel like there were a myriad of names being thrown around left, right, and center, with, again, some people going all in on Wells, who ends up being blindsided here with him being called out for a shift in behavior, which, again, felt pretty unfounded. But we also get some bickering between Wells and Robin, with Wells also proceeding to call out Sam here as well, which I did think that was pretty suboptimal play for Wells, as Sam seemed to be pretty trusted here. Sorry, I doubt most of this cast genuinely thought Sam could be a traitor, and through that kind of ruined his credibility, which I would not be shocked that kind of led to the number of burn votes that were going on here. And again, the similar thing goes for Tom here as well, as he proceeds to call out Chrishell, who by this point seemed to only be targeted by Tom, and we see her proceeding to call him out over how he's targeting her just because she's friends with his ex, which seemed to completely dismiss his argument. Oh, we see Ivar being called out by Sierra and Dolores, as they have the very basic read that Dorinda dying means that he is a traitor somehow. I don't know how people fell for that. But also, we do have seeing some anti-housewife sentiment and targeting Robin, which just ends up leading to this just being a bunch of chaos here for this first round table. Just everyone calling out each other. But funnily, despite that, not a single traitor name mentioned along the way. But again, we do get to the vote, which ends up being extremely close here, with, again, votes going all over the place, with it ultimately becoming a 5-4 to 4 to 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 vote. Again, just insane. And Carolyn ends up having the deciding vote here, which ends up being for Wells, where ultimately Wells, again, only gets 5 votes here, 2 of which being from the 2 people he called out, and Sam and Robin, the 3 coming from the survivors, who all end up voting together here, which I assume has to be purposeful. But again, we never really got to say any of that coordination happening. But really, this ends up being a pretty shocking first boot here, of Wells being pretty high on my estimations coming into this season, him just kind of flopping here. But also, we see Dylan here talking to Robin and Ion about how now he has sus on Bob the drag queen, because Bob threw out Wells' name and didn't vote for him, which I guess. I mean, again, he's right, but again, I really did not feel like this was much evidence at all. But then we do get a lot of focus around who is going to get the shields, with us seeing Rob instantly give his to Tony, which I thought was a pretty cool moment here. Again, seeing them interact here after not even getting to play together on Winners at War. And again, I do think this was the correct call for Rob here. Again, giving it to Tony, someone of a similar threat level to him, where in turn, that could be a good ally for you. And again, this could secure that relationship, but also somebody that is a big shield for you as well. Oh, while we see Wes decide to give his also to a survivor player here, giving his to Jeremy, which again, I thought was also a good call for Wes here. Again, to try to attach himself to this survivor alliance that seems strong at this point. They, again, had literally all just voted together to take out Wells, where again, I think that was a good play from Wes. Oh, we see Derek obviously give his shield to Danielle, as he promised, right? Only for him to give it to Dylan instead, because obviously Derek would never give a shield to a woman. But really, I do think he looked at Dylan as, again, this new potential Cody figure for him and wanted to secure that relationship, which, again, I do think there are merits to that move, where, again, for someone like Danielle, again, Danielle is going to be working with you either way. And, again, I think if you don't tell anybody who you gave the shield to, I think people are just going to assume that Danielle was probably the person you gave it to anyway. So, again, I think Derek probably ends up making the right call here. But anyway, the episode ends at the turret with the reveal to the other traitors that Rob is a traitor. Which again must be so weird for the traitors themselves here, just have Boss Rob just again barging into this already formed dynamic, to where I guess it's episode 3, where the decision to murder here still ends up being extremely messy, with everyone seemingly just wanting a different name here. Again, Carolyn wanting to murder Brittany, which Danielle's incensed at, as again that would pin the murder on her. And again, we see Rob attempting to be this mediator between the two and trying to get everybody on the same page, where it did very much feel like Rob was kind of treating this as if this was like his alliance, that he was going to run the show, and like wanting them work as this collective, though again he ends up being largely ineffective in getting them to do so. But the ultimate decision on who to pick here does come down to them still trying to continue to pin it on people, which again you would think that after it didn't really work particularly well with Ivar, that again it would be kind of obvious at what they're doing at this point, but again they still decide to go with the strategy, and finally this time it actually ends up being somewhat effective. But we see Bob really pushing here for Ayan, which is what they ultimately end up choosing. And to be fair, for Bob, I don't think this is a bad move. I mean, Ayan is actually one of the few people that is sussing Bob the Drag Queen at this point, where, again, unbeknownst to him, this is actually a good call. But from his own rationale here, I think it is questionable. Again, it feels like this is a move that they did to, like, pin it on Tony, but also to sow chaos, as, again, who would murder Ayan? So, again, while it does end up being effective in taking down Tony, again, I think Tony was going down anyway, and Ayan was someone that, again, was just kind of a non-factor in the game. Again, I don't think she really had much of a strategic bone in her body. So again, I do think there were better picks here, people that had more influence in the game. Plus, also, again, by picking another housewife, it does largely clear the other housewives. As, again, why would the housewives kill another one of their own numbers right away? Again, it feels completely illogical to think that they would do so, to where, and I just personally think that going for a non-housewife and one that had more influence was probably the better path here than going for someone like Ayan. But again, this is where I do want to stop down and talk about the boots before getting to the following breakfast, where, again, we lost Wells in the banishment, and Wells is someone that, again, I thought coming into the season was someone that had so much potential. Again, he was someone that a lot of people were hyping up. Again, someone that seemed to be very intelligent, and someone that I do think if he was able to stay past this round probably would have been a pretty dangerous player. Again, once he started to get more information, though, and he just kind of gets sniped from the very beginning, where, again, a lot of the sus against him was kind of nonsensical to me. So again, I do think he kind of gets a rough exit from the season, even though I don't know how much of it was necessarily things he did wrong here. And also here we end up losing Ayan. And again, I think it's a travesty we lost Ayan so early. I mean, Ayan is someone that was just such an incredible character through the very short stint that she had. Somebody that I think could have been like one of the stars of the season had she made a deep run. Yet again, instead we only got a couple episodes of her in a spot where we really just got like a couple humorous confessionals, but not much else, which again, I think is such a shame, considering I do feel like Ayan, even just through her like postseason activities, has really showcased just how incredible of a character she could have been, which again, we sadly don't get to fully see here. But then we get to breakfast the following morning, where we do get a lot of negativity here surrounding Danielle and her really overacting here, talking about how shaken up she is and openly saying that she thinks Brittany was murdered as the traitors are trying to pin it against her, which again felt like her doing too much here. And we do end up getting Rob scolding her in the confessional for this, and also see Jeremy proceed to pick up on the fact that she's a traitor here because of how funny she's acting, which is really funny to me, as again, Jeremy's someone that's notorious in my mind for having some pretty bad reads on Survivor. So for him to clock a traitor in this moment here was very surprising to see. But the fact that we are seeing Danielle here as this like terrible player on their show, yeah, in person it seems like Danielle's shtick was taken seriously, and people did believe that's just who Danielle is, again, leads to this big disconnect to me between the edit and how other people are perceiving Danielle, where it did seem like a lot of people genuinely looked at her as this frantic player, and not too off from how they looked at someone like Carolyn, which is kind of insane. Though, again, I do think a lot of that comes from the fact that I don't think a lot of these people knew who Danielle Reyes was. Or again, I think if you know her reputation, I think you would pretty clearly think otherwise that she kind of had to be a traitor here. But anyway, here we also see Carolyn being annoyed at the murder and talks about how no one listens to her. Where again, I don't disagree with Carolyn's strategic decision making here, where I actually think most of the time what Carolyn wants to do is the optimal play. But again, the issue with Carolyn is that she's so ineffective in getting others to go along with that play. And to follow that out, we continue to see Carolyn be underestimated here, with Bob Harper even calling her batshit while she's in the vicinity, which is kind of insane. But also here we do get some concept from Tony with him making the decision here to not tell anybody that he has a shield, which I did find that to be a very questionable play, where obviously again, the Cage Boys know that you have the shield, to where again, this just adds another opportunity for him to look even more sus when this later gets revealed, where again, I felt like this was just kind of an unforced error from Tony here. Though again, at the end of the day, either way, Tony was such a massive target at this point, to where I do think he was always going to naturally have this massive threat level coming into this season. But mixing out the fact that now we also have the Ayan murder, which just further gets the others to turn against him, it really just felt like almost everybody was on board with taking out Tony, to which we do end up seeing Wes trying to save him here, warning him about the votes coming towards him. But Tony doesn't seem to end up doing anything that really is able to counteract that momentum. But anyway, we get to the mission where we see the players getting paired up, having to enter a fun house with balloons and have to choose between 4 doors. And if they're able to get their balloon to the end, they end up getting money for the prize pool. Though if they end up selecting a wrong door along the way, a clown barges through the door and pops their balloon, which was so ridiculous. And while the challenge itself here was not particularly notable, as again everyone just ends up failing here and they get no money or shields by the end of it, we do get some fun drama here from the fact that the players themselves have to come up with the order, as obviously the later you go, the more info you have, and with the aspect of the first duo to get to the end ends up getting a shield, we do see a lot of people wanting to go later in the order, leading to Bob the Drag Queen once again being upset how it's the same people volunteering over and over again, leading to Bob Harper calling out Tony, wanting Tony to go first, leading to a little bit of bickering between the two, which was kind of humorous, but it leads to Tony being strong-armed into going first here, though again it ultimately doesn't end up mattering, as again no one ends up getting through anyway. But this does end up leading to Tony being gung-ho about targeting Bob Harper, which again is another play here that I did feel like was the wrong call, where again Bob Harper had a good chunk of supporters here where no one was genuinely thinking of him as a traitor, and with Tony again just not giving a good alternative to vote for, it did feel pretty clear that Tony was kind of screwed here. Along with that, we do end up getting some setup here to the Bambis, this alliance of Rochelle, Gabby, and Nikki that end up being pretty against Tony in this spot. They end up coming off as a largely likable group here, though at the same time an alliance that ultimately doesn't really end up mattering that much outside of just painting a bullseye on their back. But eventually we do end up getting more focus around Danielle, with Bob the Drag Queen ending up telling Danielle about Jeremy saying her name, finally telling her that he didn't believe the crying, which again you would think would make her stop overperforming, which she doesn't do, though I guess to be fair, again that would lead to people thinking that she had changed and people probably sus for her anyway. But also here we do have Dylan continuing campaign against Bob the Drag Queen, telling Boston Rob about this theory, only for Rob to try to shift the blame onto Robin, again saying that he doesn't want Bob to go home this early, which fine, I guess. Which again, his opinion on that surely won't change. But we do have Rob here talking about how he's worried about losing a traitor, which again, I do really question just why, as again, it's not the worst thing in the world for you to lose a traitor at this spot, especially if you have 4 of them, and especially if you're able to get away with it without getting any blood on your hands. Where again, if Dylan was able to organize the votes against Bob the Drag Queen, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world for Boston Rob at this point, especially considering how much influence Bob seemed to have in the game. And again, it would have been a better situation for him than what ultimately ends up happening between him and Bob. But through that, eventually we see Jeremy being informed of this Bob the Drag Queen plan, which goes back to him having bad reads once again. And that despite him trying to save Tony in this spot, he does end up scoffing at the idea of targeting Bob the Drag Queen, which again, that's more of the Jeremy that I know. But again, this leads to him warning Bob, leading into the round table where, again, I felt like there was very little doubt that Tony was going home, but we do get some fun drama where we do end up seeing Dylan starting off the round table, going for Bob, only for Bob to instantly shut that down, with him being really incredible TV whenever confronted, having so much gravitas in the way that he speaks, and having this iconic line here of telling Dylan his drag name should be misguided. But obviously, again, we do end up spending a lot of this round table with Tony on the defensive, with us getting a fun back and forth between Bob H and Tony being really incensed in him being targeted here. But again, it seems to fall on deaf ears, though we do end up seeing Jeremy come to Tony's defense here, which was a really great moment for their relationships, and Jeremy talking about how Tony crushed his dreams and has every right to get him out, but he genuinely doesn't think he's a traitor, which again, I thought was a nice payoff to their arc, though again, I kind of wish it extended beyond that. But this is when we finally get Boston Rob cutting in and proceeding to call out Tony for not revealing the shield they had the previous night, and also for not talking to him the entire day, saying, "I didn't think you were a traitor, but now I don't know." Essentially fully throwing Tony under the bus here, with him saying in confessional that he has to do it because he has to protect Bob for some reason. And again, I think him targeting Tony in this spot here is a terrible move for his game. As I already listed out beforehand, I think there are a lot of benefits to him working with Tony, especially considering Tony is someone that I think would have ridden it out with the survivors as long as he could. But also, again, Bob is someone that you need to get out sooner rather than later. Now again, I get that Tony was probably going home anyway, and Rob letting Tony go here and further throwing him under the bus is something that can be looked at as him looking even more faithful, as again, he's doing what the other faithfuls are doing. But ultimately, I do think he's in a spot here where he is letting go of a pretty integral number for his game, which I think ends up being a massive misstep here, especially with a later murder as well, where I do think it leaves Boss Rob with very little room to maneuver following this. But ultimately, Tony does end up getting voted out here with the majority of the votes against him. though does proceed to have a pretty iconic exit here, where we shockingly see Tony getting very emotional for really the first time I've ever seen him like this in any of these reality shows, but we end up seeing him tell Boston Rob as he leaves that you're a sellout, bro, which was so funny to me. Again, really funny that we're ending this season with beef between Boston Rob and Tony, but also really funny in the sense that it felt very reminiscent to what Rob said to Coach when he got voted out in Heroes vs. Villains, where again, seeing that now being aimed at Rob was also funny to me. But either way, following this, we do get the reveal that tonight there will be no secret meeting for the Traitors, where instead they'll have to choose on 3 players to shortlist in plain sight, having to write down their names on a scroll in the wine cellar, where those 3 players will be publicly put into coffins, and the Traitors will have to nail one of them down to murder them, with also the additional rule here that one traitor may be shortlisted, which, like, why would you do that? That just makes you a massive target, considering it's always going to be assumed that at least one of the people in the coffins is a traitor, which we do end up seeing them attempt to get Carolyn to go along with this, which again, she rightfully shuts down instantly, as again, no one should be doing this. But we once again see him putting not much credence into Carolyn's thoughts on this situation, and the fact that we literally see Bob, Danielle, and Rob gathered together in the cellar without Carolyn, with her just stumbling around trying to find the others. Though right away we do end up seeing Danielle and Bob talk about taking out Jeremy, which I think is a really dumb move, really for the both of them, really actually for every traitor involved here. Again, I think it's bad from Bob, as again, Jeremy was someone that genuinely wanted to work with Bob, genuinely didn't think he was a traitor, literally leaked information to him just earlier that day. All for Danielle, obviously this is putting a lot of sus on her. Again, we've seen this already on this season, where people take these things at face value. Now the murdered player was targeting someone, that targeted person has to be a traitor. And again, with her murdering Jeremy here right after Jeremy pretty openly targeting Danielle, again, that's pretty bad from Danielle's point of view. But again, this is also a terrible move for both Rob and Carolyn as well, as again, Jeremy's fellow survivor players, they're taking out another number for them. And again, for Rob, again, he needs numbers like Jeremy, especially again, someone like Jeremy who's gonna want to keep Rob around. Again, Jeremy's all about wanting to keep around these meat shields in the game, and again, you would think that he would want to take Rob towards the end of the game, even if he did think he was a traitor. So again, I thought it made no sense why Rob wanted Jeremy out in this spot. Well, also for Carolyn, again, it limits her options as well. Mind you, I actually think this is the least bad for Carolyn, even though Carolyn was the one that was stumping the hardest for Jeremy in this spot, where again, no one's sussing Carolyn either way. But again, we once again see her have no influence in this spot, as the others just agree upon Jeremy, though we end up seeing him being thrown into the coffin alongside Nikki and Sierra, which ends up essentially dooming their games as well here, where again, just this general sus over anybody that was in the coffins ends up being this looming target on their backs, and so both of them are eventually eliminated, which really just highlights how bad this would have been if a traitor had thrown themselves into this spot. But either way, the episode ends up ending on the cliffhanger of the traitors end up exiting the cellar together, with Gabby ending up hearing them from the back of the room, setting it up as Gabby's gonna catch the traitors here, which, I mean, she does ultimately end up hearing Danielle in particular here, and ends up being sus of Danielle briefly because of that, but ultimately not too much ends up coming from this, and thankfully so, as again, I think it would have been really lame for a traitor to be caught simply because of how this twist forced the traitors to get together, and they were just seen leaving a room together. Again, that would have been a really dumb way for them to lose the game, and I don't know why production would want that either. Would they really want their entire game to be ruined just from this one twist? Like, imagine if Gabby had seen all 4 of them and they proceeded to be systematically taken out until the end. Again, that would have made for a boring season. So again, I think this is something that probably needs to be workshopped for down the road. But anyway, we start episode 4 with Dylan getting sus that something's happening right now, which I assume was probably production related, and the fact that obviously they were probably given more time after the round table than normal, but also the fact that it felt like players were missing, which again, I think would have also added to how lame it would have been if the traitors got caught in this spot, where it would have kind of felt like it was due to production giving a bit of a tell in this moment. But and we do ultimately see him find the cellar, though not the scroll of names, which essentially means almost nothing really comes of this. But anyway, Alan ends up calling all the players to the front of the castle, where Jeremy, Nikki, and Sierra end up entering the coffins, with Sierra finally popping on the show here, just openly calling out the traitors here, with Sierra coming off as a really fun character for the show. The problem is that she was shown just so inconsistently. Oh, we do end up seeing Jeremy take the opposite approach, saying that if the traitors keep him, they'll end up working with them, which is something that surely would have hurt hurt his status with his fellow faithfuls if he had survived here. But I do respect Jeremy giving this last-ditch effort here to survive, though ultimately it obviously doesn't end up working out for him, with him ultimately being the one murdered here, with him giving this very somber confessional, crying about how he's not able to give the money to his family, which again, I did really feel for him there, even though, again, he's won $1 million. He's also assumingly got pretty big appearance fees for both Winners at War and Traitors here. Again, I think he'll be fine. But either way, the murder ends up being portrayed here in a pretty over-the-top way as the Traitors come out and start nailing the coffin clothes, which, again, like, who cares? I actually don't particularly love this twist from an entertainment point of view. It really just did not do much for me, though. Again, I'll at least applaud them for trying something new, but again, I just found most of this twist kind of harmful for the game, where again, it just allows this opportunity for the Traitors to potentially be caught, but also kind of stagnated the game for a bit, where again, this looming threat over Nikki and Sierra, along with also the Cage Boy twist as well, really just makes those people in particular these massive targets that really feels like a lot of the sus that was placed on the remaining players in the game was not really tackled until after those players were already gone. But again, before we move on, let's talk about the boots in this round, starting off with Tony. And again, I love Tony Velachos. He's probably my favorite reality TV character of all time. And it was such a shame to lose him so early on this season, though it was not unexpected. Again, Tony's someone that I never expected to do well in the Traitors. I feel like he does not really fit with the show. I feel like his really frantic energy just feels like something that would just instantly put sauce on him. And again, we saw that play out. I think this appearance again was very similar to that of Survivor Game Changers, and him playing very aggressively and it being pretty messy, even though again, he kind of came into it with no real chance to begin with. And that was completely in contrast to the other player booed in this round, that person being Jeremy. And Jeremy's someone that I really was hoping was going to have a really strong run on the Traitors here. Again, I had Jeremy as my winner pick coming into the season. I really felt like Jeremy had a lot of potential. But while I've clowned on Jeremy's ability to read people at points, I did still feel like he would have been a trusted faithful that people would want to keep around. I looked at him as like the CT of the season, though it really felt like none of that was really founded. It felt like a lot of people were just kind of sus of him anyway, and obviously gets sniped out of the game after finally having a good read. And again, I just felt like it was kind of a disappointing run for Jeremy, not because I necessarily think he played that poorly, but just because it just ultimately did not work out for him, which again, I think is a shame. So I did feel like he had a lot of potential on this season. Well, that we then move on to the following breakfast, where we do get focus on Gabby, who reveals that she heard a group congregate in the cellar the previous day, specifically again naming Danielle, which the housewives instantly shut down here. Danielle again seemingly doing good work in building trust with them, though I'll say Danielle actually does end up handling this situation pretty well, where once Gabby ends up mentioning this, we see Danielle unpromptedly mention the fact that she did go into the cellar alongside Dylan, with the fact that Dylan was a pretty expected faithful at this point. It does largely debunk Gabby's clue here, which was good work from her, because otherwise, again, this should have been a very obvious clue. So again, following that, Sierra and Nikki end up becoming the very obvious targets here, with Tom being very sus of Sierra and thinking that she got recruited for some reason. I don't know how. None of that makes sense. Like, when would she have gotten recruited? Also, like, why couldn't she have just been picked as a traitor? And what difference does that make anyway? Like, I genuinely did not understand the logic here. All while we end up seeing Wes be sus of Nikki for at least more logical reasons. Again, Nikki being a wrestler, aka a performer for a living, and she's been reserved in the house, which again, I think you can get a bit more in the fact that obviously you would assume that she has good acting abilities that would help her as a traitor, but obviously this doesn't end up being accurate either. But anyway, we get to the mission, which ends up being another kind of interesting one here, where they have to transport statues to the top of a hill where each player gets a head, but there are only 10 bodies, to which each player that's able to get their head on a body ends up getting a shield. Again, another challenge here I thought turned out to be pretty fun. Again, adding in more of these social strategy aspects. And again, do you end up being selfish here, going for your own head, or do you end up helping the others and help carry up the bodies? Again, I thought there were interesting dynamics in play here. Something I didn't love about this challenge is obviously how physical it ends up being, which again did obviously give this massive advantage to the stronger guys as they end up carrying their own heads up and being the first ones up, making it more likely that they obviously get the shield in this spot. But and otherwise a fun challenge where we finally end up seeing Bob the drag queen trying to control things from the very beginning, only for no one to end up listening. And obviously we get Tom being selfish here and being the first one up the hill, plopping on the first body up as expected. But here we do end up getting a lot of content here revolving around Bob Harper and him struggling to get up the hill, with him not being in the shape he used to be due to previously having a heart attack. And this ends up being a pretty big personal segment for him, something I don't fully expect from the Traitors. But again, we do see others stopping to help him, and he does end up eventually getting a shield here for some reason. But also here we end up seeing Sierra really want a shield here as well, only to be shut shut down by the others, saying that she clearly doesn't need one, as they all think she's a traitor, which she's shocked to hear. But also, obviously, even if she isn't, obviously traitors are going to be keeping her alive, as she's just an easy scapegoat. So again, there genuinely was no reason for her to get one, even though she, for some reason, thought she was going to get murdered that night. But it's following this challenge where we really get the inciting incident for the remainder of the episode, but really for a lot of the season. The fact that Bob the drag queen here says that we think that one of the new guys is a traitor, which again seemed to be a common assumption, again, that the Cage Boys had this target on their backs, again, where one of them had to be a traitor. But this ends up really upsetting Rob. Again, looking at this as Bob throwing him under the bus, which I believe Bob has said post-show that he was actually meaning to throw Wes under the bus with this comment, as again, it was actually more assumed that Wes was a traitor in this spot than Rob, but obviously ends up implying Rob here as well. And this is where Rob ends up saying that this is a problem for him and decides to just go for a head of the dragon, starting to put the work together to take down Bob the drag queen, where obviously this ends up being Rob's landmark move on this season, and one that he executes very impressively, but also it's kind of a game-ending move here. Now, the thing is, Rob obviously is screwed either way, like no matter what. I think it's tough to believe a world where they're going to allow Rob to get to the end, especially with the sus on him from just being a cage boy to begin with, but I think also considering his reputation, again, there was just no way he was ever winning this season. I do think him making this like really big, bold move here, and doing so with such confidence, just furthers the target on his back, as again, why else would he go so far out of his way to pull off this move and be so confident that Bob is a traitor unless he's one himself? So again, it's bad from a perception standpoint of the other faithfuls, but also I think it's very bad from how the other traitors perceive him. And to be fair, again, like Danielle is someone that I don't think would have ever taken Rob towards the end. Carolyn's someone that always had this inherent distrust of him, to where again, ultimately it probably wouldn't have mattered, but again, this just fully sinks their relationship, to where again, there really is no trust within the traitors from this point forward, with both Danielle and Carolyn holding resentment against Rob following this move, which again just causes further fractures within the turret, which also seems to counteract the entire point of sacrificing the likes of Tony and Jeremy the previous round, where again, it felt like Rob did that to benefit the traitors as a collective, only to now blow up the traitors in this spot, to where again, it really feels like he gets the worst of both worlds, losing out on those inherent allies he had coming into the game, but also now losing out on these other potential allies in the turret as well, where again, I just felt like all this was just such sloppy play from Rob. But again, I do think the work that Rob does here to make this go through is very impressive. Again, just seeing him corral all these votes together in a spot where everyone seemed to be scared to pull the trigger beforehand was impressive to see, where we had seen previously in the episode that Dylan tried to pull over Dolores, and again, they agreed that they think Bob the drag queen is a traitor, but end up backing down due to just not having the numbers to do so. But it is here where we see Rob pulling in Dylan and telling him that tonight's the night, as if he's again this mob boss. It ends up pulling in the likes of like Trishelle, Sierra, Ivar, and again, it starts to feel like this vote could actually happen. Though later we end up seeing him talk to Danielle and Carolyn, but pretending to them as if he's not the one leading this vote, where again, it did seem like Rob was very much hoping that Dylan would do a lot more of the legwork to make this vote go through, which would allow him to maintain his relationships with the fellow traitors, though again, Dylan ends up just not being effective enough in that, to where we see Rob coming into the round table, deciding that he has to go all in here to make this move go through. Which again, I get that once you start to put the cogs in motion, you do have to follow through with it, as again, otherwise Bob can catch on and turn the tables on you, but I ultimately felt like this was a move that was just so unnecessary to make in this current position. Again, this does lead to an all-time great round table here, where while it does start pretty tame, as we do waste a lot of time on the Nikki or Sierra of it all, eventually Rob ends up blurting out that this is all a distraction and they have their eyes closed, saying that one person has been quarterbacking this entire show, and gives this big reveal when he turns his head and stares at Bob the drag queen, which again is just portrayed in such an overtop way. And again, there's so much gravitas in the way that Rob presents this here that makes this such a badass moment here. And we see Bob just being completely shocked here and proceeding to say pretty clearly rehearsed line of saying that he has 9 words. I swear to God that I'm a faithful. Which again, there's no way you're coming up with that in the spot. And again, we get a really funny response from Rob saying, well, I have 2 words. You're not. It says, the gig is up, bud, and I got ya. Which again, I just thought this version of Boss to Rob was so humorous to see here. And it does lead to this like really great back and forth between the two, which was again just so surreal to see Boss to Rob in a fight like this, where I feel like we very rarely see him in a true confrontation. But also we get this great last stand here from Bob and him calling out Rob for being scared of him, and Rob ends up accusing him back of being scared and not trying to flip it on him. And again, all this was very fun to watch, though again, it should have been very clear that this was like traitor on traitor crime here. But ultimately, we do end up getting another little funny moment from Bob and Zac Efron catching a stray here, and Dylan talking about how Bob is a great actor and he knows because he grew up with one, only for Bob to say not a good one, which again, based on what I know of Zac Efron's current filmography, I feel like that seems a bit unfair. But again, all this easily one of the best scenes of the entire season. I think probably the scene that I will always think of when I think of this season, with this being such a massive turning point for this season. But anyway, we get to the vote reveal where shockingly we end up seeing Danielle being the second person to reveal their vote, which I don't know why they didn't leave her for later in the order. But again, she ends up voting for Bob here, which again really saps all the suspense out of the vote results here. As again, if Danielle is flipping against her number one ally in Bob here, it's very obvious that the rest of the votes are going towards him as well. And again, while we do get some Sierra and Nikki votes along the way, and Bob himself ends up voting for Rob in this spot, a good majority ends up landing on Bob, and Bob ends up having this pretty fun exit here, pretending that he had never lied and saying that he swore to God, but then says that he did lie as he doesn't believe in God and that he's a traitor, which gives us probably one of the biggest reactions to the traitor reveal in the history of the show, with us seeing everyone congratulating Rob in this spot. And that is except for Danielle, who is clearly emotional while everyone else is happy, which again should have also been a tell. And we cut to her crying confessional, clearly feeling guilt over betraying Bob here and saying fucking Boston Rob. But again, Rob ends up being looked at as a hero here initially, though obviously that goodwill doesn't last too long, as already by the end of the episode we end up seeing some doubt being cast here, with Wes talking to a group about what the right read should be, and that how else would you know that someone else is 100% a traitor unless you're a traitor yourself. To which we see like Tom Sandoval being shocked at this, really showing you his level of gameplay, but also in kind of a faulty move from Wes, where obviously we see this layer spread around, and I do think this further paints his target on Wes, again showing him as a schemer in the game, and again ends up making Rob pretty gung-ho about getting him out, which again I think is pretty suboptimal play. But either way, the episode does end up ending on a cliffhanger just as the traitors get to the turret, with Danielle swearing revenge against Rob, taking us to episode 5, where things are tense and awkward, but probably not to the level that the previous episode hyped it up to be, where we do have seeing Rob explaining his move and saying that he'll never come for either of them as long as they don't come for him, which very much felt like Rob using this Bob move in a similar way to how he used the Matt Elrod move in Redemption Island as this fear tactic to show people what would happen if they betray him, and again trying to get people to remain loyal to him, which while it does end up leading to them acquiescing to him for these next couple rounds, they clearly are in this spot where they're just simply waiting for the others to finally get their act together and take the shot at Rob for them, where again it really just felt like Rob could not rebuild that trust with them following this round, though we do end up seeing Danielle trying to suck up to him in this spot and just allow him to do whatever he wants, where Carolyn actually tries to bring up Gabby's name in this spot, which is again kind of surprising considering how close they seem to be. But again, as a strategic call, I do think it makes a lot of sense here to get rid of Gabby, again splitting up the Bambis, but Rob instead wants to go for Robin, which ends up being a good call for him, as Robin did seem to be targeting him at this point. But I'll say getting rid of another housewife here did seem a bit overkill, as again it is literally down to just Dolores, though again to be fair you would have probably had to murder Robin eventually anyway. Though again I think the benefits of this play are something that I don't know if Rob even knew at this point. I don't know if Rob knew that Robin was coming for him. It didn't seem like he did. It was more so just targeting her because she was trusted. Though also I feel like Robin is someone that up to this point had been notoriously wrong about almost everything, where while she did finally get a right read here and that Rob was a traitor, again I don't know if he necessarily knew that, but again Rob does end up getting his way here, meaning we end up losing Robin. And with that, again let's talk about the eliminated players from this round, starting it off with Bob the Drag Queen, who is someone that I was very disappointed to see him go out this early. Now again obviously this was the best case scenario if you were to go out this early, where this was just incredible TV to see Rob turn against him in this way, but also Bob was just such an incredible narrator throughout these early episodes. It's someone that again while I was personally not familiar with Bob, I did feel like watching him on this season really makes me want to see Bob on other shows, potentially return to the Traitors as well. Again I think there's a lot of potential there. I think Bob, while again a very messy player, was someone that was just so fun to watch, but also just has such a notable exit from the game as well. And also, obviously, we end up losing Robin. And Robin was fine. I mean, again, she was kind of wrong at almost every single turn. That was a little bit humorous, but really outside that, Robin was just kind of okay. I mean, to be fair, though, she was probably more entertaining than I expected her to be coming this season, where I remember hearing about how boring she was. And again, I thought she at least brought some drama at points. Again, her calling out people and again, wrongfully so. Again, at least brought some fun drama. And I do think if she stayed, she probably would have had some potential, considering, again, she was going after Rob, and who really knows what happens from that point on. But she's ultimately someone that, again, I just think was just kind of fine on the show. But with that, we then cut to the following morning where despite Rob's move the previous round and people starting to get sus of him, we do surprisingly see him not even be listed as a potential target in this spot, with everyone's eyes still being on Nikki. So we do still get a lot of focus on Rob here despite that, with Rob learning about Wes's sus on him, with Ivar and Sam leaking it back to him, where again, it did seem like despite there being this sus on Rob, people were actually more suspicious of Wes, which is pretty insane considering just how much evidence there was against Rob at this point, and considering the evidence that continues to build against him. The fact that he wasn't the number one suspect out of the Cage Boys is something that I do think is actually pretty impressive from Rob's point of view. But here we do see Rob confronting Wes over this information, with Wes just lying to his face and denying any involvement, to where we finally see Rob just clearly not buying a single second of it. But this does lead to us setting up this looming Rob v. Wes battle that we obviously get in the following round. Anyway, then we cut to the Danielle side of things, with her obviously wanting to target Boston Rob, but saying that to do so, she'll need a traitor to work with. Which again, you would think at that point, that means, oh, Danielle's just going to patch things up with Carolyn and work with Carolyn. There'll be this united front against Boston Rob. But no, instead she says that she can't trust Carolyn and now needs Carolyn gone so she could recruit a new traitor, which makes no sense. Where again, first things first, again, like how is she planning on getting rid of Carolyn? Again, no one believes that Carolyn is a traitor, and you just out of the blue throwing her under the bus with no real evidence here is something that clearly won't end up being effective. But also, this entire notion of needing to get rid of Carolyn so that she can recruit a traitor that would work with her is so ridiculous, as in that world, Rob is still a traitor and also determining who would get recruited alongside Danielle. To where in that spot, why would Rob allow anybody to get recruited that would work against him with Danielle? So again, all this just felt so misguided, and the reason she even feels like she needs to do this is because again, she is just assuming that Rob and Carolyn must be close due to their Survivor connection, when it feels very clear just that she wants nothing to do with Boston Rob, which really makes this entire move that much more pointless. And it really is just the start of Danielle's sloppy play across the episode. But with that, we get to the mission. A mission of them being given riddles, and they have to step forward to answer, and if they're wrong, they're eliminated, but if they're right, they get to put a player's portrait into one of the shield frames, where only 2 photos can be up at a time, and the 2 that are remaining at the end of the game end up getting shields. Again, another interesting wrinkle to the challenges here, where obviously if you get a question right and there's already 2 pictures on the wall, then and you could take one down in place of another, and an easy way to cause some drama here. But really at the end of the day, not much drama actually ends up stemming from the actual picks here, though we do get a lot of messiness from how Danielle ends up playing all this, where again, Danielle performs pretty well in the challenge itself, again getting multiple questions right, though ends up making some very questionable decisions with those correct answers, where again, first up, her first choice that she makes here is to give a shield to Dolores over herself, which again, already very sketchy, as again, why aren't you protecting yourself if you are faithful and would theoretically be scared of being murdered? But also the way that she ends up doing this is by taking down Derek's photo over Tom's, which makes no sense, as again, why are you potentially burning a relationship with Derek in this spot for Tom Sandoval, who you have absolutely no connection to at all, to the point where Tom himself was shocked the fact that she didn't take down his photos. Again, I think that was terrible play as well. But then she ends up getting another question right and proceeds to just undo all of that and ends up putting Derek's picture back up again instead of her own, at least in the way the show portrays it, where I know Rob has done exit press saying that there was actually a point where Danielle did put her photo on the wall, but then proceed to take it down herself along the way, which is again just also very sloppy play. And here we do end up getting some negative confessionals here from Rob and Carolyn, who are both aghast at the fact that Danielle was doing all this. Though interestingly, again, most of these confessionals do come from Rob and Carolyn, her fellow traitors. They're really the only faithful that we see talk about her negatively here ends up being Chriselle, and even then, she's found it a tad sus, but not even really being like fully committed on the fact that she's a traitor, which again just makes this come off as a situation where the show is fully portraying this way worse than what it came off to the players themselves, to where, while again, looking at the actual decisions being made here, it is atrocious gameplay. It doesn't actually seem like Danielle actually got much sus out of this, where it felt like, again, this playing into the fact that a lot of people just saw her as a very frantic, emotional player, though obviously from a traitor perspective, it does become very see-through at how poorly she is playing replaying all this. But again, following this, she continues her very rocky gameplay, with her then proceeding to actually put her Carolyn plan into action, telling those in her car back that you guys just have to trust me, with again no credible information here as to why Carolyn is a traitor, to which we see Dylan instantly not believing her. But then we also see her try to pull in Brittany, and even telling Brittany that Carolyn threw your name out, which is just kind of weird considering, and she's referring to Carolyn throwing her name out to murder. And what do you know, Brittany still doesn't believe her anyway and doesn't think that Carolyn is capable of being a traitor. And really, again, all this just very sloppy play from Danielle. I mean, by the end of this episode, it already ends up backfiring on her, where we do end up seeing Dylan ratting Danielle out to Carolyn, completely severing the trust between Carolyn and Danielle, even though, to be fair, again, I don't think they were poised to be working together long term either way. But it does end up leading to a lot of the frostiness that we end up getting at the turret. It's also here where we finally get some focus on Chrishell, saying that she's conflicted and scared right now, seemingly thinking that she's found the traitor, which again, considering the previous content about her a little bit sus of Danielle after challenge, you would think, oh, she's finally clicked in her head that it's Danielle, only for it to reveal that no, she thinks it's Nikki, with her again turning against her own Bambi in this spot because Nikki made a face while in the car earlier, where, I mean, we did see Boston Rob like proactively lie about Bob supposedly going after Nikki, and Nikki seemed to be genuinely upset by that, to the point where Chrishell was like, well, she has to be a traitor because why else would she be so surprised? Obviously, this ends up not being true, and really just in general, this is terrible for Chrishell's game. Obviously, it's terrible in the sense that she's wrong and losing an ally here for no reason, but also in the world where Nikki is a traitor, this is a terrible move. Again, the optimal strat for the traitors when you're playing as a faithful is to keep around a traitor that is an ally of yours. Is again, that person's going to protect you from murder, but also be a number for you during banishments, and also a person that you could theoretically just snipe at the end. So again, it's really mind-blowing to me that we're still in this world where so many people on this show just simply do not understand the optimal way to play this game as a faithful, despite the fact that we even had Sandra openly talking about this during last season's airing, where again, this is just an outright terrible move for Chrishell, and it's really funny considering she's revealing all this to Boston Rob of all people, again, an actual traitor, which again, all of this just made it very clear that Nikki was pretty doomed coming into the round table. But the round table itself ends up focusing around three names here. Obviously, Nikki, Sierra, and Rob, where we do finally end up seeing Nikki defending Rob throughout this, fully going in on Sierra, seemingly based on this misunderstanding of the rules, not thinking that the traitors were allowed to throw each other under the bus, which again is not exactly what the rule is. The rule is more so the fact that you can't expose yourself as a traitor and utilize that information to tank another traitor, where again, you could simply throw another traitor under the bus, and if you couldn't, that would be really stifling gameplay in a really uninteresting way. But I do find it funny that they just allowed her to have this misunderstanding of the rules, which did impact her decision making in the game, though to be fair, it ends up helping Boston Rob through this, which again, you would assume that's what they wanted anyway. And also, to be fair, it's kind of on her for not realizing what the rules actually meant. But here we end up also seeing Bob Harper calling out Rob here, being the type of player that would make a big move to establish dominance, which is a fully correct read here. And what do you know? Bob Harper gets murdered because of it, with Rob at this point essentially just saying screw it and just murdering anybody that is openly against him, claiming that person was murdered to frame him, which again is seemingly effective for a bit, though again, never felt like a strat that was going to work long term. But again, I don't think anything would have worked for Boston Rob this season long term. But beyond that, the rest of the roundtable ends up focusing around Nikki and Sierra, with a lot of back and forth between the two, with Sierra having a really ridiculous line through this, asking Nikki if she's ever laughed with her gut, which it's like, what does that even mean? But unshockingly, we do end up getting to the big moment involving Chrishell, of her deciding to speak up and throw Nikki under the bus, which again, must have sucked from all angles. Again, for Nikki, obviously having one of your best friends betray you here, but also for Chrishell betraying one of her best friends, like to later find out she's a faithful. But again, ultimately, we do end up getting a near unanimous vote against Nikki here, with Dylan being the only dissenting vote, with him just out of the blue voting for Gabby, which, sure, again, you're also wrong. But again, it did feel like a spot where like him having found Bob the drag queen gave him a bit of confidence, thinking that he had really accurate reads in the game, which I mean, in reality his only accurate read was Bob the drag queen. But anyway, following that, we'd end up getting some focus around Derek, who has become increasingly sus on Rob ever since the Bob the drag queen move. And here we do end up seeing him and Wes solidify their alliance and their trust in each other, seeming very solidifying the fact that they are both faithfuls, and talking about now taking the shot at Rob the following round. around, which for Derek and Wes, I do get this rationale of why they would want Rob out here, as again, if Rob is a traitor and ends up being confirmed to be a traitor, that does end up largely clearing Derek and Wes, as it's very unlikely that two of the Cage boys end up being traitors, with them being added late into the game. But I do think an issue I have with this general plan here, though, is the fact that we're not even halfway through the game yet. And for them to be the clearest people in the game that early on in the game is actually not a good thing, as obviously that just makes them prime targets for murder. In a spot where, again, if they just didn't target Rob, knowing that Rob is a traitor, Rob's more than likely going to protect him in the game, as, again, one of the Cage boys is going to be assumed to be a traitor. So through that, Rob keeping them in the game benefits him, keeping more doubt in who exactly of the Cage boys is a traitor. So if that never ends up getting confirmed, again, it gives him more legs in the game, to where I do think for Derek in particular, this just ends up being an outright bad move, in my opinion, because especially considering he's the person with the least amount of sus of the Cage boys. I just feel like this is a move here that simply did not need to happen right now, where all he's doing is just peeking up a bit too early and just making him a pretty ripe murder target for Rob for down the road. But anyway, the episode ends up ending as we arrive at the turret once again, but before anyone ends up saying anything, with a lot of setup about how they don't trust each other anymore, which leads to really one of the most surreal turrets I've ever seen, especially up to this point, where again, it is just insane how dysfunctional the Traitors end up being on this season, where we get to episode 6, where Carolyn reveals that she's heard her name today, and it was coming from Danielle, leading to them bickering back and forth, with Danielle obviously denying doing so, during which we have Rob with his hands in his face, which again is very funny to see here for me. Again, just seeing Buster Rob at this level of disbelief at how dysfunctional this grouping is was funny, even though, again, Rob definitely deserves a lot of the blame for how dysfunctional this group is. But again, we do end up seeing him yelling at them, telling them to stop, and that we're supposed to be working together, which clearly they weren't. But again, we see Rob here being kind of frantic and trying to win back Carolyn here, something that he's never able to actually do so, which is pretty bad from his point of view. And it says that he did seem to actually be genuinely loyal to Carolyn, where it did seem like he actually wanted to go to the end of Carolyn, yet Carolyn was just never able to trust him from this point forward, which, and to be fair, his reputation definitely plays a factor into that. But also, again, I think how he conducted the Bob vote off also was a major factor. But again, this ultimately concludes with Carolyn telling them that there's no one I want to murder except for you two, which is, again, is such an insane thing to say to your fellow traitors. But ultimately, Danielle ends up admitting to all this, ends up apologizing, saying that she'll make it right, which did seem genuine from Danielle here, where, and we see her stop campaigning against Carolyn beyond this and talks in confessional as if she actually does want to work with Carolyn deep into the game. But again, I think for Carolyn, it was just a spot where it was very difficult to rebuild that trust at this point, to where, again, it simply doesn't end up working out for her. But again, as for the murder, we do end up seeing Rob initially want to murder Wes for coming after him, which again would have been a terrible move, as it really just makes him the next on the pecking order. But finally, we see Carolyn and Danielle shut that down, only for him to then want to murder Bob H instead, which is again a much better call for him. But it's still somebody, again, did openly target Rob beforehand, and this being a spot where people are going to call that out and would probably paint a bigger bullseye on Rob's back, though again, Rob fully commits to the bit at this point of going all in on targeting those that went after him. And considering Bob H is also like a very trusted faithful and not a shield for Rob in pretty much any way, unlike Wes, again, I do think this ends up being a solid move for him, even though, again, it ends up being a marginal choice, as again, he was kind of on borrowed time either way. But with that, again, let's talk about the boots before moving on. Starting off with Nikki Garcia, she was fine. I was actually kind of underwhelmed with her, considering, again, like as people were saying, I expected coming into this that she would be this big character. The fact that she was a very prominent wrestler, you would think she would have the skills there to be very entertaining on the show, but she was just kind of normal and really didn't end up doing that much, where again, I felt like she was kind of a pretty irrelevant character until she was already on Death's Door, and she was someone that I thought could be really fun coming into the season, but just someone that did not bring too much to the show. Also, I feel like kind of the opposite thing for Bob Harper. And Bob Harper's someone that, again, coming in this season, not particularly hyped for him at all. I don't think anyone was. But on the show, I thought he ended up being a fun character. I thought he had some good moments here and there. And him calling out the likes of Tony and Boston Rob, where, again, it seemed like he was someone that was at least gaming pretty hard and had some pretty decent reads on the game. I thought Bob Harper was a pretty pleasant surprise on this season. Very someone that exceeded my expectations in terms of entertainment value he brought to the show. But finally, we get to the next breakfast, where we do end up getting a lot of focus around Derek. With, again, this clearly being the episode where Derek was going to make his move against Rob, talking about how Rob would be murdered if he was a faithful, and the eyes would be on him if he walks through the door. And what do you know? Rob walks through the door, where we do see him trying to convince Wes to fully go in on Rob, which, again, I do think is actually a better move for Wes than Derek. Where, again, I think Derek had a lot more to lose, considering he seemed to be the safest of the Cage Boys, while Wes is someone that was, again, kind of on his way out anyway. Again, for him, I do think he should have just gone all in on Boston Rob, with him really having nothing to lose in this spot, and instead he ends up playing a kind of background role in all this, which I do think was the wrong way to play it, where we really end up seeing Derek take the lead of this vote, despite very clearly not wanting to take the lead, where, again, it felt like a lot of this was him trying to convince Wes to be this openly anti-Rob presence so that he can kind of fade into the background, obviously not get that bullseye on his back, which, again, would have been the optimal play if he was able to do it. But, again, I think we're in a spot where, again, Derek knew that he wasn't able to get anyone else to really lead the charge against Rob, to where at that point you would think you would just not do it, as clearly you're going to become a big target from doing so. But, again, he kind of does it anyway. And we end up seeing Wes here be scared, talking about that if they're wrong about Rob, then it's game over for him. It's, again, like, it's game over for you either way. You might as well just go all out in this spot. And this is all while we end up seeing Rob really leading the charge against Wes in this spot. Again, using the fact that Wes was very vocal about Nikki, and also the fact that he threw Rob's name out earlier to pin this bullseye on him, which, again, obviously is not the optimal call here, as, again, Wes is this perfect shield for him, always this person that's going to be targeted over him of the Cage Boys. But at the same time, obviously, Rob's options were extremely limited at this point, to where, again, I do think he essentially went with the best argument he had, even though this argument is still very bad for him. But meanwhile, we do end up getting some focus on Tom Sandoval here, with him getting more Dodo content over the fact that he has a new theory, that being that Dolores is a traitor for some reason, even though everyone knows that Dolores isn't a traitor, because why would she murder all of her housewives? And also, again, Dolores is a player that I don't know if would be capable of being a good traitor. Though, again, to be fair, they thought the same of Carolyn. But again, we do get some fun content here from Brittany, who ends up having some great DRs here mocking him, which, again, is kind of the perfect content you would want from Brittany. And with that, Brittany's finally on the show. It's a miracle after being very under-edited for the first 5 episodes of the season, though, again, this is kind of the point where her edit kind of picks up here. But we do end up seeing her being more involved in the game at this point as well, with us seeing her talking to Carolyn. And like Dylan, ends up ratting out Danielle to her. Now, indirectly, as, again, she was more so asking Carolyn about what she heard about Carolyn targeting her from Danielle, which obviously ends up spooking Carolyn here, who, again, thinks that this must have happened this morning, and that Danielle had already gone against her word from last night, which, again, was a full misunderstanding here. But again, something that just further severs the trust here between Carolyn and Danielle. I'll say, once again, gameplay-wise, from Brittany's point of view, I'm not sure why she's doing this and what she was planning on getting out of this. Like, again, if her plan is to work with Danielle, as I know Brittany has claimed post-show that she always knew Danielle was a traitor and was keeping her around, trying to do the optimal strat. And if that is the case, why are you just opening up the opportunity for us all to fall back on Danielle and Danielle to be targeted? Like, that seems kind of ridiculous. And obviously, I get that it's her, like, attempting to repair her relationship with Carolyn, but it doesn't seem like that was really going anywhere. So I do think she just would have been better off just not doing this, and through that, her and Danielle probably would have had a cleaner ride following this. But anyway, we get to the mission, which was probably one of the more boring missions of the season, feeling a lot more in line with the previous seasons of them being split into groups and having to collect gunpowder and blow up a traitor statue, which, again, was kind of boring. Though we do end up getting shields distributed, 1 per group, and we do get some humor here from Carolyn snatching the shield away from Tom just as he opens the crates, where she ends up with one of them. Also, we end up getting Derek really wanting a shield here, only for Chriselle to get it for his group, which, I wonder if that'll matter. Only for Dylan's group to decide to use rock, paper, scissors to determine who gets the shield, with Dylan saying here that he's actually won a rock, paper, scissors tournament, because I guess that's a thing, and what do you know, he wins, because obviously he's very good at rock, paper, scissors. But it's here where we finally do get the setup to the Carolyn-Gabby relationship, with us also adding more fuel to Carolyn's distrust of Danielle, with Gabby revealing to her also the fact that Danielle threw her name under the bus, and giving Carolyn a lot of ammunition against Danielle moving forward. But points, we again get a lot of focus on Derek once again, trying to lead this vote without, again, looking like the leader, where we see him going to Ivar, now trying to get Ivar to take credit for the vote, saying that he's thinking about voting for someone that you brought up last night, with Ivar just not knowing who he's talking about, which is all very funny. And beyond that, we even see him, like, lying to Brittany about how he's not leading this vote, where again, it really just feels like Derek goes so far out of the way to try to make this vote go through without taking credit for it, which again, I just think further harms his game. But through this, we do end up seeing him telling Danielle about this vote, with Danielle actually getting on board here, which again, another sloppy play from Danielle here. They're again wanting to vote for Rob, despite the fact that the votes themselves were not secure. Again, even Brittany was against this plan, so again, I don't know where Danielle thought the numbers were coming from. And through her later voting for Rob, it obviously ends up just burning all of her relationships in the turret. Again, now she's targeted Carolyn, she's openly voted Rob. Again, she essentially leaving herself with no real allies following that. But either way, we get to the round table where we do start off with Dolores calling out Tom for coming after her and allowing them to make his case, which was funny, as again, it was so irrelevant to everything else going on. And we literally see Derek get annoyed here and shut it all down, saying we have too many things to talk about. Anyway, Derek ends up going directly against Rob here, laying out all the evidence and actually making a pretty logical pitch here. So it did seem like Derek was kind of winning today initially, only for Rob to then retort pretty effectively here, again counteracting the argument of why he hasn't been murdered yet, by also calling out Ivar for being in a similar spot, and then turning this around, arguing who would be smart enough to be pinning the target on him, and proceeds to throw out Wes's name, to which we end up seeing Chriselle actually supporting Rob through this, with her seemingly being completely snowed by him, to which this ends up leading Wes to retaliate. So while he initially makes a pretty good point actually, and calling out Bob's comments about the Cage Boys as something that really spurred Rob into making that move, he then proceeds to just threaten the others that if you vote for him, then he'll come after you, which is, again, not a good call there, and ends up obviously being very gloaty as he typically is, talking about how he's the winningest person at the table. And again, this ends up essentially being a death knell for him, with us just seeing people being annoyed at how he's talking here. But it's also here where we get the introduction of another plot thread to this round table, with Carolyn finally speaking up now and proceeding to throw Danielle under the bus, which is again kind of insane from Carolyn here as well, for her to just openly be throwing out a traitor's name in a spot where you did none of the legwork to actually secure the votes against Danielle. And again, we do see Danielle being extremely taken off guard by this. And what do you know, in typical Carolyn fashion, no one ends up listening to her here. Which again is kind of funny that Carolyn is literally telling the faithfuls a traitor, and none of them believe her and instead decide to target Wes instead. Or again, they just simply look at this as an emotional move, which again is just the way they perceive Carolyn. But anyway, we get to the vote reveal where straight up at this point, I was fully expecting Boss Rob to be going home. Again, I came in this episode thinking Rob was a goner. At this point, I also still thought Rob was a goner, even though Wes made some missteps. And despite that, Wes does get voted out here. And to be fair, Rob does get a fair share of votes here, but still, I was pretty mind blown at the fact that Rob even survived this round. Again, this was a spot here where he had no right to survive this. There was so much evidence against him and very little proper evidence against Wes. So the fact that the majority here end up trusting Rob over Wes here, I think is pretty insane, and is actually, again, very impressive that Rob is able to get through all this. But ultimately, Wes does have a pretty fun exit from the game here, talking about how much better he is than all of them, and fuck all you guys as he leaves. But also during all this, we do get another interesting moment here from Derek trying to get Dylan to switch his vote to Rob at the last second, only for Brittany to attempt to talk him out of it, furthering this sus that Derek has on her, leading to a pretty funny interaction after the round table of Brittany asking to talk to Derek to yell at him, obviously being upset at him for lying to her earlier, and this just leads to Derek just openly calling her out as a traitor, and proceeds to tell Dylan in his final words that Brittany is a traitor, which obviously plays a factor into the following episode, though also this made it very abundantly clear that Derek was going home, as again, why else would they be showing this, as again, this normally would not matter unless Derek was murdered and Dylan was the one to pass on this message, as again, otherwise they would just show Derek passing on this message to the others in the following episode. And it is funny to see Derek here literally point out exactly what ends up happening here, and that Rob's gonna murder him and claim that they're doing so to frame him, which again makes it even funnier considering the fact that Dylan just doesn't end up buying into this, despite the fact that Derek literally told him what was going to happen, which again would be fine if Dylan was doing so to protect Rob and again try to do that optimal faithful strat, but I don't think that's what he was doing. I think he legitimately just did not want to believe that Rob was a traitor. But with that, we then get to the turret, which somehow ends up being even crazier than the last, with again no one trusting anybody, where we get again Danielle calling out Rob for starting all this chaos by taking out Bob, and Rob fighting back, saying that Bob was writing a death certificate for him because surely no one would have ever thought of the concept of a cage boy being a traitor until Bob mentioned it there. But we then get to the Carol and Danielle side of things, them bickering over the Brittany info, and Danielle saying that, well, you did say her name for murder, which just leaves the other two so shocked that she would use that info against them. And again, all this is just so dysfunctional, leading up to Carolyn just outwardly awkwardly saying here that we need to go after Danielle, and Danielle saying, I'm going to fight back, and they bicker over if Danielle has any information to use against Carolyn. All this is, again, just so insane to see two traitors in the turret fighting against each other about how they're going to be taking each other out of the game. Again, it is just one of the most insane sequences I've ever seen on the Traitors. Possibly one of my favorite moments in the Traitors history, where, again, the pure outrageousness of this entire situation just feels so unprecedented. This is such a fantastic way to end this episode, taking us to episode 7, where the Traitors just seem so checked out and not particularly interested even talking about who to murder here. And we even proceed to see them not even trust each other to tell each other information about the shields. Though again, we do see Rob wanting to do exactly what Derek had previously predicted and him wanting to murder him, only for Danielle to instantly fight back against that, as again she should, considering Derek is a very close ally of hers. But we do then proceed to see her turn down any of the other alternative names, which is something's got to give. But to be fair, I think Rob would have pushed for Derek either way. Again, knowing Boston Rob, I don't think he was taking no for an answer there. To where we do ultimately see Danielle give in here to allow for a fresh start with Boston Rob, which she certainly takes advantage of, and is definitely a thing that Boston Rob would do, is go back to working with somebody that betrayed him, because again, that's definitely Boston Rob's MO. But anyway, with that, let's talk about the boots. We did lose Wes, and again, Wes is someone that I was very excited to see on the Traitors. I thought he would have been a perfect pick here. And again, he was fun TV. Again, he had a really interesting exit from the game. He still is this person who gives great confessionals. I think kind of just fit the overall vibe of the show, to where, while obviously he didn't have a particularly deep run on this season, I feel like he's someone that, again, was at least fun to watch. And then we move on to Derek. And Derek's somebody that, again, I do respect Derek's game on Big Brother. I think it's one of the best in the history of the show. That being said, he's also one of the most boring winners in the history of the show. And again, seeing him on the Traitors here, I thought was interesting from a legacy perspective, in the sense that we're finally seeing Derek on another show. But at the same time, wasn't that excited for it, in the sense that, again, Derek would have been boring. And to be fair, I feel like this probably plays out the best case scenario for Derek, to where, while again, I think he is still a pretty mundane character, he did actually bring something to the table here. Again, his feud with Rob and him going after him, I thought was really interesting. Him being taken out in the way that he is was, again, an interesting fall for him. To where, while again, I think Derek is still, again, kind of a boring character, when I think played a pretty faulty, faithful game here, I do think his trajectory on the season was actually kind of interesting, despite him still being a pretty boring personality. But then we cut to the following breakfast, where we do get some fun content at the very beginning here, from Brittany and Ivar being the first to enter, with us getting a great Brittany confessional here, calling him furniture, and us also getting a later funny moment from the fact that Gabby ends up talking about Ivar, not even realizing that he was there already, which is all pretty apt based on how relevant Ivar is on the season. But here we end up getting a lot of focus also on Danielle, who ends up being very emotional from the offset here, clearly feeling guilt from the previous murder, which again should have been a very big tell. I'm both from an edit perspective of who was murdered, but also from an in-game perspective of just how obvious it should be that she's a traitor, because why would she be this emotional over Derek leaving before it was even announced that he was gone? But it's also here where we get a lot of focus on Tom finally having a good read in the game and thinking that Rob must be a traitor, which again seemed to be based on how he simply just couldn't look past the initial step, which again, his lack of critical thought in this situation ends up actually working to his favor, and him being very gung-ho against Rob. While some of the others do actually seem to buy into Rob's spiel here about how he's being framed, again, including Dylan, who decides that the one person he needs to tell Derek's info to is Rob, one of the two people Derek told him was a traitor, which again is insane. But again, Rob ends up learning through this that Derek was saying Brittany's name, which did seemingly convince Rob they need to target Brittany next, which again felt like a largely misguided move from him here, in the sense that while there are some people that were sus at Brittany at this point in the game, and he did seem to have this argument already created against her, and how she's a gamer and she's exactly who is smart enough to be able to frame him. But again, I do think he would have had a much easier time organizing votes against, again, Danielle, but probably even more easily against Tom Sandoval, where, again, I just think there were much better options for him here. Yet he ends up going with one that, again, ends up being probably a more difficult sell. Anyway, we get to the mission where we see them having to go head-to-head in pairs to get shields, where 3 pairs will end up winning shields, while 3 pairs end up being at risk. meaning that a relatively small grouping of players here will end up being vulnerable this time, making winning the Shield tier even that much more important. But we do end up seeing the matchups here be picked randomly, which really adds just a very random element to this overall round, in the sense that these matchups that were determined here end up having a major influence in how this round plays out in the game, as we do end up seeing that beyond this, the two pairs that are paired together here end up essentially being sequestered together, as obviously they have to film this challenge 3 times with these 3 different matchups, which leads to us seeing a lot of downtime with these being spending time together in spots where they're clearly just waiting for the other rounds of this game to wrap up, which ends up leading to a bit of stagnation in the gameplay during this round, as again, initially the players can only talk to those in their groups and have no influence on essentially 2/3 of the cast at this point. So we're mixing that with the fact that supposedly they also end up only having like 15 minutes to talk before the round table itself. It does, again, end up making this a pretty difficult round to really try to shake up people's minds, to where, again, I do think Rob is someone that ends up being kind of harmed with how this overall round was structured, where, again, it really stopped him from being able to spin his scenarios to the entire group. Though, again, despite that, he actually is able to convince his own group that he wasn't a traitor, with all of them actually ending up not voting for him by the end, where, so again, I do think he was a bit screwed here, even though at the end of the day, again, he was obviously not making it too much deeper either way. But and the challenge itself here, though, ends up being kind of lame of them having a pseudo endurance comp, at least initially, of them having to hold their partner's hands, all while they have bugs and snakes poured on them, which is like, whatever. Again, I've seen this enough on all these different types of reality shows. This really does nothing for me. And we do end up seeing Trishelle freaking out instantly and end up dropping out from the very beginning, which ends up automatically giving Rob and Sierra shields, though they do end up having to last 8 minutes here if they want to get money for the prize pool, because I definitely care about that. I thought this was a nice little moment for Rob here and him like coaching Sierra through all this, and they end up lasting the entire time along with every other pair, because this is not that difficult of a challenge. It was also just kind of a boring one. Again, the Sam and Ivar versus Tom and Dylan matchup was particularly unnotable, with, again, no one really having any big reactions there, though it does lead to Sam's first confessional since the premiere, so that's something. But also here we do end up seeing Danielle and Brittany get some focus, with them seemingly being back to working together in lockstep, especially after Derek's elimination, where at this point Danielle has really no other allies. But again, we end up seeing them run a tiebreaker, which was just finding a ring inside of the cage that their hands were in. The fastest one to do that ends up winning the shield, which was, again, boring. Again, I kind of wish they would have played out this endurance competition, obviously added things to make it more difficult. Again, ending it in this way instead just was kind of lame. But again, we do get a fun moment here from Danielle and Brittany ending up winning this challenge, which, again, it was cool to see them coming together here, and again, this being a continuation of their storyline from Reindeer Games. Oh, well, we also see Sam and Ivar beat Tom and Dylan, in case you were interested in what happened there. But either way, it was pretty clear this is where Rob was eventually going to go home. Though, to be fair, I did think that was the case for the previous couple episodes, and considering the fact that it didn't happen that time, again, I guess you never know. But again, we get so minimal content before the round table, and mixing out, again, just the fact that this round was structured in the way it was, it would have been very difficult for Rob to get out of this. And we do see him attempt to make this case against Brittany, though it was pretty clear that anybody that wasn't with him during the mission just wasn't really buying this. And we do end up seeing Tom do a lot of campaigning here against Rob, and tries to take credit for getting Rob out, with him getting a confessional gloating over how people are finally taking him seriously. And I can assure you, they were not taking him seriously. Where, again, I think this is just a spot where people already had their minds made up. I don't think Tom really did much to change people's minds in this situation. Where, again, I feel like this move ends up going through, again, kind of despite of what Tom does, where it feels like none of the work that he actually does here ends up being particularly effective. Although I do feel like Brittany ends up putting together a pretty decent argument against Rob, to where I did particularly like her final point that she makes here, and talking about how if we leave Rob in the game, we're just going to be in the same position the following round anyway, of just wondering if Rob is a traitor and if we should take the shot at him, to where, again, you might as well just take him out in this spot now and kind of end that never-ending cycle, to where, again, it just felt like Rob at this point was just such a massive distraction, to where even if he was a faithful, it's still something that, again, is essentially stopping them looking at other situations that you might as well just get rid of this world and deal with their consequences afterwards, which, again, I do think really for everyone involved here, again, I think it's just the right call. You just gotta get rid of Rob at this point, whether you think he's a traitor or not. just to open up the game following this. And again, I think Brittany's argument here was pretty effective, to where we do see the likes of Dylan and Chriselle end up switching their votes off of her by the time of the vote, ending up voting for Gabby and Tom respectively, with only Sierra ending up sticking with Rob's Brittany plan here, which ends up further sinking her reputation, which did feel like a situation very similar to what happened with Shelby after the Cody vote in Traitors Season 1, but we do end up seeing both Danielle and Carolyn here ending up voting for Rob, with him just ending up getting the bulk of the votes here, and we obviously get this big reaction to his elimination, with him also having some kind of salty final words here for Danielle, saying that she's a bad traitor, a bad game player, and just bad all around. And with that, I should mention the fact that obviously with Rob gone, he was the last cage boy to be eliminated from the game, in a spot where, again, I think it just further shows, one, the fact that they should have worked together. I mean, the fact that they didn't just let them going out in succession, but also I do think it just furthers the point that having these players added in late is just kind of a negative to the game. Negative in the sense that obviously it puts this massive bullseye on these late entrants, as again, no one's ever going to be particularly confident they aren't traitors, while also they end up, again, just being this big distraction for the faithfuls, which ends up, again, kind of stagnating the gameplay, as, again, the faithfuls are always going to be preoccupied with needing to take out these late entrants. So, again, I just think as a whole, the way this plays out here just further solidifies my thoughts on just people entering late just being a bad twist for the game. But finally, we get another twist being revealed here, in the fact that the 6 at-risk players will now be walking down the aisle overnight, where the traitors will have to commit their murder face to face. Why? Where, again, I really do not find this particularly entertaining. Though, again, they always try to hype this up as like this big deal. But again, I just find it always like pretty anticlimactic. Well, in general, like I would be fine if murders as a whole were just face to face. I do feel like the fact that we obviously have it in this one situation, they try to make it as if it is this big twist to the game. It's really something that, again, doesn't really matter. It doesn't affect the game, as again, the players that will see that this was done face to face are out of the game, and otherwise, again, there are these minor ramifications that we will talk about in terms of the concept of the players that survive still having these experiences at the church. But outside that, again, it really does nothing for the game and really does nothing for me as a viewer either. So, I just felt absolutely nothing with this twist. But anyway, we still do end up actually getting a turret here, though. Danielle redeclaring that she does want to work with Carolyn here, only for Carolyn to obviously still continue to not trust her and openly call her out here for being more loyal to Brittany than to her, which again felt pretty clear this was not going to be a particularly good working relationship. But again, we end up ending the episode, the vulnerable players walking down the aisle and giving these really over-the-top speeches, with Dolores saying to the traitors that you better kill me as I'm coming after you, because that's something Dolores is definitely known for, being a super threatening player in the game. But ultimately, we do end up seeing them decide to murder Chriselle, which is a fine pick. Again, someone that is pretty clear. No one really thinks she's a traitor outside of Tom, I guess. And someone that didn't seem to have a particularly close relationship to them. And also someone that you can theoretically use to point a target onto Tom. Though, obviously, no one's really going to believe that. But, again, a fine pick. But once again, the reveal to her ends up being just super underwhelming, with Chriselle just having no reaction to this, which I found pretty humorous. But anyway, with that, let's talk about the eliminated players. Talking about Boston Rob. And, again, I think this was actually probably one of Boston Rob's best appearances on really any individual season, where, again, I'm someone that I do defend Boston Rob as a TV character. I think a lot of people get very sick of Boston Rob just because we've seen him over and over and over again. But I do think he is a riveting television character. I think he has a great way of talking to the audience, while also someone that is going to play the game hard. So again, I've always liked Boss Rob as a TV character, and I do think this is actually my favorite appearance of his in recent years. Again, this is a very different Boss Rob than we typically get, one that is essentially playing from the bottom the entire time, but is also still like pretty successful at points in getting things done. Where again, just seeing what he was able to do at the round table was so fun to watch here. Again, him targeting Bob the drag queen, him fighting off against allegations from Wes and Derek, him actually seemingly being pretty effective considering all things. And considering this massive target that was on his back to begin with, and the fact that he was a cage boy, again, I think he plays this pretty well. So while I obviously have nitpicks here and there about certain decisions he makes, I do think this is overall a very strong performance from Boston Rob, with his overall appearance on this season probably being one of the main things I'll remember in the years down the road. But also here we gotta talk about Chriselle, who I thought was a bit of a dud, sadly. Again, Chriselle's someone that I was actually excited for coming into this season, as I know she's someone that was a big fan of these social strategy shows. She's a diehard Big Brother fan, and through that, again, I was very much expecting her coming into this season being a pretty solid player. but instead she just ends up being, again, just kind of boring, not really bringing much entertainment to the show, but then also, again, not really doing much in the game, where, again, it felt like she made that one move of targeting Nikki, which was a terrible move, and proceeds to just fall into the background and never really getting anything right in the game, to where, again, I thought Chriselle here was just a bit of a disappointment, considering I had high hopes for her coming this season, and she didn't really live up to any of that. But anyway, we then get to episode 8, where at the breakfast here, we do see each of the vulnerable players coming in one by one, allowing each the time to talk about their experiences, which is where we finally end up getting some focus here around Sam, which I wonder why he's getting that content right now. But again, he ends up coming off actually kind of savvy here, again, trying to test those that are coming in to find out who has a different story from the rest, to parse out if one of them is a traitor, which, again, I thought was a very savvy move here. I did not expect Sam to be the one to utilize it. Now, conveniently, the point where it actually would have mattered is one where it doesn't work out for them, where we do end up seeing them testing Carolyn, and we see Carolyn kind of stammering around here, only for Tom to end up answering her question for her, with Carolyn kind of getting out of this pretty clean, despite the fact that the edit shows this as a very awkward interaction. Though I'll say again, I think it would have been very lame if Carolyn got caught in this way, where, again, I think production standpoint, they should be allowing the traitors to be run through the exact same situation that the non-traitors are going to be put through, to avoid situations like this, where hopefully they rectify that for years down the road, though thankfully, again, it didn't end up mattering in this spot. But anyway, we get to the mission where again, we have them being split into two teams, one that stays at the castle while the other one goes with Alan, though with the wrinkle that the ones that go with Alan end up being the only ones available to get a shield, which, again, we've seen in the past. But here we end up seeing them do rock, paper, scissors to determine who's in the shield group, which I will say, underreported story here is the fact that despite Dylan's previous talk about always winning rock, paper, scissors, he actually ends up losing rock, paper, scissors here. Again, I have a feeling he might not be as good at rock, paper, scissors as he claimed. But overall, this challenge ends up being a very convoluted one when that takes them to the typical cabin, though here they end up having to find 4 dolls that play nursery rhymes backwards, to where we have the players at the cabin have to call up those at the castle and relay the message to them, allowing them to then record their own rendition of it and then play that backwards so they can hear what the nursery rhyme is. And again, all this, it just felt like too much and just so convoluted, but also a challenge here that provides some really fun character moments, particularly from Tom, who ends up being the only one to actually try in this challenge, as everyone else was much more focused on finding the shield, which Sierra ends up finding and certainly gets to use. But again, the content here revolving around Tom ends up being so fun here. Again, him attempting to sing into the phone, which just sounded ridiculous, and we do get this perfectly interlaced with Brittany mocking him in confessional, but also here we end up hearing Sam make a bevy of funny comments, calling him a terrible singer and telling them to get someone else to do it. But also here we end up getting a great shot of just Alan laughing in the background as Tom is singing, and just all this was so funny. Probably the funniest scene of the entire season, and really this scene alone justifies the casting of Tom on this season, despite him being pretty unlikable and someone that, again, I was not particularly excited to see coming into this season. I do think this one scene alone made it all worth it. But again, who would have guessed they finished the challenge with only 6 seconds left, which I'm sure was fully accurate. Though as for the vote itself, again, we do get a lot of talk about how they don't have much to go with here, with Sam saying the only evidence that they have at this point is Coffin Night, with Sierra becoming the clear target for the remainder of the episode, with no real suspense here, as again, it never really felt plausible that the vote would go any other way. As again, like the Rob situation, just becomes the obvious move here to take out Sierra, just to clear out all the worlds and take away this distraction, which again is kind of the issue of the twist to begin with. But here we do also end up seeing Sus going Brittany and Danielle's way as well, with Sierra really trying to lead the charge and splitting them up as a strong pairing in the game, and a strong pairing that, again, both have their individual bits of sus as well, to where, and it did seem like the two were the next in the pecking order. But again, after Sierra, where while we do see Carolyn talk about wanting to take out Brittany here instead to be able to pull in Danielle closer, and we do see her warning Sierra about the target on her back, again, like every other plan Carolyn ends up coming up with, this one also doesn't go through. But again, we end up getting to the round table, which just start with talk about how the traitors are likely to be women, which does come from a very meta perspective here, where obviously the other two traitors here were men, which again, you would think practically production were likely to pick people from other genders, though to be fair, we did actually see in Traitors UK Season 3 where all women were picked, where again, you never really know, but I do think this does make logical sense here, especially when adding in the fact that, again, look at the remaining men, where again, we got the likes of Tom and Ivar, who are clearly not good enough to be traitors. Sam is someone that's been clear for a while at this, and then we have Sam and Dylan, who have been extremely clear for a while now, where again, it just made logical sense that the traitors were likely to be women at this point, and when mixing the fact that also Dolores was someone that was very clear as well, this does end up really narrowing down the field, where it just felt like the first point where Danielle and Carolyn were pretty close to having the games collapse on them. But all this is followed up by another really great Tom moment here, and him trying to add to this conversation by saying that girls are better cheaters than guys, to which we instantly get this uproar from the women here, with obviously this just being an insane thing to say, especially coming from Tom Sandoval of all people. Though obviously this ends up being a Freudian slip in him actually meaning traitors, to where we end up seeing him try to walk back the comment. But again, all this just such a funny moment here. Again, another dodo moment from Tom, which again made his casting here worth the price of admission. But again, we end up spending a lot of time here with Sierra trying to defend herself, laying out the cases for Brittany and Danielle, finally having more evidence for Danielle, but actually ending up targeting Brittany instead for whatever reason. And while again, Sierra had no real chance here, I do very much respect the fact that she did go out fighting, but it ultimately does lead to a unanimous vote here, as expected. Though we do end up following this up with setup to Danielle's upcoming fall, with Dylan even now looking at her as a target, with again, this coming up at the first point after the Cage Boys and the Coffin Players are all out of the game. Again, what a shocker that all this building sus on Danielle finally ends up amounting to something at this point. Again, the first point where social reads are actually utilized to target people. But following that, we actually get some intrigue from the following turret, in that we do see the cabin group having agreed to keep it secret that Sierra had the shield. Though we end up seeing Tom proceed to lie to Carolyn that Sierra didn't have it, with Carolyn actually seeming to believe that. So again, good on Tom Sandoval for doing something right, especially as this does lead to, again, tension in a turret as we proceed to see Danielle tell Carolyn the truth, only for Carolyn to actually not believe it. But again, there clearly being this big divide between the two still here, the two also having just radically different opinions on what they should be doing in this spot, where we do end up getting the reveal that they're now allowed to recruit this round, where technically they should have been allowed to do so the previous round as well after Rob went, though couldn't because we definitely needed that face-to-face murder. But here we do see Danielle wanting to recruit, particularly Brittany, which was never happening, with Carolyn scoffing at this idea, as again, why would she give Danielle more leverage in the turret? Carolyn just has no reason to be going through this move here, and all it really does just add further tension here. Carolyn just outwardly being annoyed at this and telling her to her face that she doesn't trust her, which ends up being the cliffhanger for the episode, which I feel like this has happened multiple times already this season. But again, also some auto play from Carolyn, just like openly telling Danielle that you don't trust her again. But again, just makes Danielle realize that there's just no way that they're going to be working together until the end, and instead makes Danielle just all in on having to target Carolyn the following round. But this is all while Carolyn ends up wanting to murder, and I do think this is a really interesting decision considering the current layout of the board, where with most other remaining players knowing about Sierra's shield, the concept of recruiting here ends up being significantly less powerful, as everyone's going to know that no murder means someone was recruited, and while recruiting another woman would have typically been a strat that would have allowed for sus to get off of you if that person's perceived to be murdered. I do think in this specific situation, one, it's extremely obvious that if there is a recruitment, that is the overall philosophy of what the recruitment would be, to where, like, I think at the end of the day, it wouldn't actually take that much sus off you, considering, again, the lack of ambiguity there would be on what exactly was happening here, to where, personally, I do think the right call here was to murder, especially with there being so many clear players in the game at this point, and with the men in particular seemingly being all clear and actively working together. I do think you very much need to thin out those numbers, as otherwise, even if you are positioned to make it towards the the end of the game, they're very likely not going to end the game with you still there when they have these other players they're a lot more confident in as faithfuls, to where, again, I do think murdering here was the correct call. That takes us to episode 9, where we end up seeing Danielle obviously relenting, and they do end up deciding to murder, with Carolyn proceeding to reject pretty much every option that Danielle brings up. Ultimately, they do end up landing on Sam, which, again, I can't believe it. Again, they definitely didn't spoil this during the next time on. But again, Sam ends up being a pretty solid pick here, where obviously you have the murder one of the guys who are looked at as very clear at this point, and him also being a player that was like starting to pick up on the game and was mostly trusted. Also, again, Dylan in a similar spot to that, being someone that both of them are close to. Again, I think it makes Sam look like a pretty easy pick here, though at the same time, in retrospect, considering Dylan's propensity to look at these players that he's close to, thinking of why is he still in the game, it probably actually would have been a better move to take Dylan out instead. But anyway, at this point, let's talk about the eliminated players. First up, talking about Sierra. And I really like Sierra on the show, actually. I thought Sierra was somebody that, again, I knew nothing about coming in this season, and I thought she exceeded my expectations here. Now, I wish Sierra got more content on the show. I do think she was pretty under-edited for the most part. I feel like the times that we got to see Sierra, she was really fun to show, being very confrontational, again, being very defensive, and just essentially being everything you would want from a Traitors contestant outside of, I guess, actually being that good at the game. But I still feel like, again, from an entertainment standpoint, I did feel like she brought a lot to the show. I just wish she was a bit more consistent of a presence on the show. Now let's talk about Sam, who I would have said it was a complete dud if he was eliminated like an episode beforehand. I think he is someone that brought nothing to the table, was barely on the show, and someone that, again, like, was just a very questionable casting choice. Though, again, I thought his penultimate episode was actually a pretty fun one. Again, he had those moments disparaging Tom Sandoval. He, again, had that pretty savvy play at the breakfast, where, again, I think he's someone that maybe had more potential than what we ended up getting to see realized, but at the same time, again, still not the most riveting TV personality. But anyway, we then move on to the following breakfast, where we obviously get lots of talk here about Danielle, with Gabby instantly seeming to be thinking Danielle is a traitor and that they need to target her, with Carolyn proceeding to back that up, all while we also continue to see Dylan being suspicious of Danielle, again thinking, why is he still alive? And it must be that his closest ally in Danielle is the person protecting him from murder, which is actually kind of funny, as the reality is that she actually did want to murder him the previous night, and it was Carolyn that actually stopped it. Again, with all this setup, I fully did think that this was the episode where Danielle was finally going home, that this was just going to be this funeral for Danielle, and while, again, there would have been the suspense along the way of, again, Carolyn getting a bit more sus, that I did feel like it was Danielle's time to go, and for Carolyn to finally win this battle, which, again, surely happens. But again, we do see the wheels get in motion for a Danielle vote here. Again, first up, seeing Gabby and Dylan talk out their issues, getting on the same page, with, again, the amount of focus that we got on their relationship here, and also considering the later result of the episode as well, to leave them as the most likely winning pair if we were getting a faithful win on this season, with both having pretty strong edits individually that were finally coming together here. But again, we do end up seeing Dylan also pulling in Carolyn to this plan, while also talking about getting Ivar on board with voting Danielle, which, I mean, to be fair, again, seeing all this set up to this vote at the very beginning of the episode should have probably been a tell here that this wasn't going to go through. But also here we do end up seeing Tom and Dolores still targeting each other, which was really stupid. And despite the fact that the final vote ended up being so clearly between Carolyn and Danielle, they end up still voting for each other at the end, which is like, why? But also here we obviously get a lot of focus on the Danielle side of things as well. First with another segment about her relationship with Brittany and getting very emotional over this guilt of having to lie to Brittany, and talks about wanting to cross the finish line with her and making it very clear that her intention now is to take out Carolyn, to recruit Brittany, talking about it's time to plant seeds against Carolyn, and that she's not playing scared anymore. And again, I did not take a single bit of this seriously when we were first seeing this, where I thought there was no way that Danielle was actually going to be the one to get Carolyn out, and I felt like this was more so just this farewell scene for the Brittany-Danielle relationship, which, again, had been a major focus on this season, which is funny considering obviously all this ended up just being genuine setup to what ends up happening in the episode. But anyway, we then get to the mission, which has them seeing a chessboard with their names on the floor, which, again, is what finally spoiled the Sam murder in the preview. But also, again, I do find it very funny that we get this, like, like pretty big set piece here. Again, this massive chessboard with this moving traitor statue, and proceed to even bring in Kate and Parvati for some reason. I'm kind of wasting them in this spot. And again, all that just for this to be a Q&A comp of them predicting how the traitors would answer questions. Which, I mean, to be fair, I do like this challenge, and obviously ends up having a major impact on this round. But again, really funny how much gravitas they put into this challenge for it just to be a glorified quiz comp, with, again, Kate and Parvati just being here just to ask questions and reacting to things in the challenge. Which, again, why? But again, it was a really interesting challenge here, specifically for the traitors, as obviously they get to decide on what to answer to these questions, and through that, obviously, they know all the answers to these questions, and getting them right obviously adds money to the prize pool, to where there's incentive for them wanting to lead the faithfuls into getting questions right. They're also doing so blatantly will obviously put a target on your back, as people will think that you must be a traitor because you knew the answers, which again can paint sus on you. Which again, I thought this was a really interesting wrinkle to this challenge here that I did very much like, where obviously I've talked about these previous twists beforehand I didn't like, and how it could put sus onto the traitors, but I found this challenge to just be a much better way of handling it, as again, it fully puts the amount of sus that they get fully onto the hands of the traitors themselves, where again, they have a lot more agency here in managing their perception. Again, both having to choose the answers and think about how that would affect people's perceptions of who the traitors are, but also how they handle answering the questions and how they guide the faithfuls, which can also affect people's perceptions. Which again, I thought this was a really interesting dilemma to add to the game, which again, I think is a pretty fair way of trying to add in these ways for the traitors to stump themselves. Again, I think a much better situation than forcing the traitors to get together in public, which can make them look sus, or having them like not be able to recite details of what happened at the church the previous night, to where again, I just felt like this was a much more fair way of being caught as a traitor, where this is obviously what ends up dooming Carolyn's game, where we do see Carolyn make some pretty fatal mistakes here, again coming off as a bit too obvious in how she knows the answers and trying to get them to certain outcomes. Again, very much pushing for Tom to be named leader of the pack, despite no one but Tom thinking that he was the answer for that. Which again, we do get some funny delusional content from Tom once again here, him again wanting to name himself for pretty much every question, to which even Parvati and Kate join in on the mocking of him there. Here we also end up seeing Carolyn be really defensive when Dolores points out the fact that Carolyn was right, where I do not think Dolores had any malicious intent in how she handles the situation. But again, we do see Carolyn acting as if she never said that, which again just became so sus, to the point where we do see Dylan realizing how strange this all is, which I do think puts a big bullseye on Carolyn's back, all while we see Danielle actually playing the challenge pretty well. Again, just staying in the background, not trying to make waves, and we also get strong content from her. They're really outplaying Carolyn in this challenge, again allowing for Brittany to be named as the biggest threat, which again would have felt out of character for Danielle to say that, but also again allowed Carolyn to name herself as the voice that's the most irrelevant, which again just puts a further spotlight onto Carolyn, where it does feel like Danielle again did these things intentionally. I knew again, Carolyn herself was very gung-ho about these answers as well, and in general, I would give a lot of the blame for Carolyn's elimination to Carolyn herself, where it felt like she was just never sus until she made these fatal errors during this challenge. But I do think Danielle does a very good job at setting up those situations for Carolyn to mess up, to where again, I do think Danielle, while I do think she gets very fortunate in certain aspects of how this episode ends up playing out, I do think she also deserves a lot of credit for really making the most of those opportunities. But again, beyond this, while we do see Dylan being sus of Carolyn, I was still fully sold on Danielle going home here, thinking that this was all just set up for a later Carolyn boot, but thinking it obviously has to be Danielle first, where again, we do see Ivar being on board with going against Danielle. We even see him talking with Tom, and they talk about how they don't think Carolyn could even be a traitor, only for them to then proceed to leak this plan to Danielle, which again should have been a big towel there, as again, why is he doing this? But again, ends up telling Danielle that Carolyn's coming after him, which obviously solidifies the fact that Danielle needs to go after her at the round table, though to be fair, I think she probably would have anyway. But again, we get a really fun round table here. Again, another one of these that's essentially just this battle between Carolyn and Danielle. Again, another really strong fight between two traitors, where again, we get a lot of back and forth here. here, where, again, I do think Danielle ends up handling all this pretty well. Again, seemingly solidifying the Dylan and Ivar votes through her arguments here. Again, calling out Carolyn for acting silly and dumb, comparing her to Forrest Gump, which I'll say not an apt comparison there. The also ends up proceeding to compare her to Columbo, which, funnily, Carolyn doesn't know what she's referring to. And I don't know if a lot of people know what she's referring to. Where I barely know who Columbo is. To where, again, a very old school reference there. But also we have her calling out Carolyn for putting her own name during the mission and calls her the silent assassin. And again, it really felt like this perfectly executed ambush on Carolyn here, who I do not think was expecting Danielle to go as hard on her in this spot. While I feel like Carolyn kind of flounders in her arguments here, where the only evidence we see her utilizing in this spot is this Brittany situation, which happened again a few rounds ago, in a spot where most of the house seemed to still just not understand what this was all about, with Carolyn keep on saying that, why would a faithful lie? Which it's really, there's a lot of reasons why faithful will lie. But again, I think there was just much better arguments to be made against Danielle in this spot. Again, where we literally saw the previous episode, they were talking about the Jeremy murder. Again, that was a massive piece of evidence against Danielle. You have that entire situation with the shields and her caring more about Dolores and Derek than she did herself. And again, there were just so many other reasons to be targeting Danielle, to where the fact that Carolyn was just so focused on this Brittany situation, something that, again, most of the house didn't even understand, I think was something that definitely did harm her argument here. But again, despite the fact that, again, I think Danielle clearly won this argument, again, I genuinely still did not believe the fact that Carolyn would be voted out here. Or again, I still thought, no matter what, Danielle's going home here. That is until we get to the first swing vote in Ivar, who ends up voting for Carolyn. Which, again, I was just so gobsmacked when seeing this, where, again, I literally spent this entire season expecting Danielle to be taken out by Carolyn, thinking that Carolyn would obviously be the final original traitor standing, especially considering how much talk we got about how Carolyn can't be a traitor, and saw pretty much everybody that left the game being shocked at the fact that Carolyn was a traitor. And again, for all that just to be completely turned around this single episode was so mind-blowing, which we obviously get another massive reaction to the reveal that she's a traitor, with Danielle doing her typical over-the-top thing of going into the corner and sobbing, which again felt a bit much, though to be fair, I do think some of this was also kind of genuine, the fact that obviously she was very excited to win this battle in this position. But despite the fact that she did win this battle, again, I still feel pretty confident. Again, she definitely did not win the war. I did still feel like it was very unlikely Danielle was going to go on to win the season, where again, considering just how much sus was on her already, it still felt like she was pretty primed to be taken out at some point before the end, along with the fact that she also got a pretty bad edit. Again, the show had been constantly showing Danielle as a bad traitor, and through that, again, just felt very unlikely for her to win this season. But again, I do think it was a very impressive episode for her. Again, I do think she plays this round extremely well. But either way, we end the episode as expected, where Danielle is obviously forced to recruit, to which she shockingly recruits Brittany. Which, again, I think is a fine move in the grand scheme of things. I mean, Brittany is somebody that, again, I think considering their outside the game relationship, and now, again, with them both being confirmed traitors to each other, I do think it's very unlikely that they would turn against each other. So, again, it is adding an actual loyal ally for Danielle in a turret, to where I do think having another number there that's going to defend you for the rest of the game, no matter what, is something that is, again, very valuable in this spot. But obviously, again, we have to end the episode before we see Brittany's reaction to Danielle being a traitor, because, again, we need cliffhangers in every show nowadays. But then we get to episode 10, where obviously Brittany ends up accepting here. And again, really cool to see Brittany and Danielle working in lockstep here. Really the first time we see the traitors not arguing this entire season, where we do end up seeing them instantly bring up Ivar as a person to murder, who I was fully expecting to go here, as again, he just seemed to make the most sense. Again, in game, he's obviously a very clear faithful, at least you would assume so, and one that also had a very quiet edit, to where, again, I did not expect him to even make the end game, to where, again, I thought it was going in that direction, until Brittany ends up bringing up Tom and Gabby, and how they are now suspicious of Danielle, which seemingly does end up changing Danielle's mind here, with them ultimately deciding on Tom, which did throw me off guard here, as I was fully looking at him as someone that would be banished within the last couple rounds. Again, is a really expendable number that no one really trusts, even though, again, probably not a faithful, but again, also someone that you don't really want to share the money with. So again, the murdering him here was very shocking to me, and I do think it was the wrong call here, with Tom being such a juicy target in the game for so many other players, and had this open rivalry with Dolores, where, again, the best call here from my point of view would have easily been Dylan. And to be fair, it did seem like Danielle was obviously pretty snowed by Dylan into thinking that he was undyingly loyal to her when, again, he clearly already had sus on her. But with him also being looked at as extremely clear and having so much influence in the game, again, I do feel like the move was Dylan. To where, again, I do think taking out Tom here was a very misguided move. And of course, despite that, we do end up seeing Tom saying obviously he was going to get murdered and that he's shocked at how good he was at this game and that he was valued and respected, which, again, I don't know about that. And I do love how, like, after his exit, we do get a final dig from Alan here, saying that for once he was actually faithful. And with that, obviously, let's talk about the boots. We're obviously going to talk about Carolyn, where, again, I'm still so surprised that Carolyn gets taken out in this spot. Again, I really did feel like Carolyn was primed to at least be the final traitor standing, potentially at least make the finale. Though, again, the fact that she gets sniped out here, again, largely due to her own mistakes, was again, very surprising to me, and something that I do qualm with, like, with the overall, like, editing of the season, where I feel like the edit throughout the season was very much like Carolyn's underestimated and felt like this, like, underdog that was gonna, again, at least triumph over Danielle by the end. Though I do think the way that the story ends up ending here ends up being a very strange conclusion here, and I guess you can, like, debate that, like, Carolyn, again, wasn't underestimated by the very end, where, again, Dylan started to pick up on the fact that she was a traitor, where, again, at least that's something. But again, I do feel like the story of Carolyn across this season just ends up being another strangely edited storyline, again, very similar to her Survivor career, where, again, that entire season was about how she was underestimated and then she proceeds to lose in a jury vote at the end. Again, this felt like a similar thing where it felt like we were meant to be rooting for her, only for her to kind of lose prematurely. But still, at the end of the day, Carolyn, incredible character. To where, while, again, I think from a gameplay perspective, it probably works out almost the same for her every single time, certain people's perceptions of her. I do think, from an entertainment standpoint, she's just an incredible confessionalist, an incredible character in the way that she reacts to things. And despite that, also having, like, a very savvy strategic mind, where, again, I think Carolyn is a truly elite reality TV character, with this season just further solidifying that. And I was talking about Tom, and again, Tom's someone that I was not looking forward to on this season. I did think he was somebody that was simply cast here because of him being a big name due to his scandal, and again, was not excited to see him on the show, though, again, he was a pleasant surprise. Now, again, I don't like Tom. I don't think many people do like Tom, but again, as a TV presence, he was a very fun character, simply just due to how dodo-ish of a figure he was. The fact that he was so overconfident in how he played the game also provided for a lot of fun character moments along the way, with him, again, just coming off as this big doofus. So again, I thought he was a surprisingly good character on the show. But with that, we then continue the following morning, where we do see Danielle and Dylan being the first to enter, with Dylan already voicing how he is suspicious of everybody, which, again, made me pretty confident where this was going. But we do end up seeing Brittany and Danielle having already planned on pinning this vote onto Gabby and working together to get Dolores and Dylan on board, with Dolores coming off as delusional as ever, talking about how Danielle is an honest and loyal person, which, again, they couldn't do a bit of research before the season. But anyway, we get to the mission where we get the reveal of a new game-changing power, something we literally just saw on the Traitors UK Season 3, the power of the Seer, which sucks. Again, it's a twist that allows a player to find out the true role of another player, which, again, isn't bad on paper, but I really do hate how they handle it on both of these seasons. Again, the fact that it happened so late on the season to where it really ends up swinging the direction of the game to that of the alignment of the player that gets it is something that, again, I don't love. Where, again, if a traitor gets it here, then they are very likely to use that as leverage to either confirm a role or fake confirm a role that would give them a lot of power in the end game. And while if a faithful ends up getting it, then they can either find another faithful, which ultimately results in them taking each other to the end, with them both being confirmed to each other at that point, especially with the added aspect of not learning the identities of the banished players from this point on. Or, again, they can find a traitor and blast them out of the game, but in doing so would also end up dooming their own game, as obviously this would lead to a back and forth between both players claiming each other as a traitor, which at that point you might as well just do a 50-50 and cut both of them before the end, which, again, essentially makes this kind of bad for the Seer themselves, but in essence most times would probably end up guaranteeing a faithful win, just not the faithful that actually had the power of the Seer. And again, I just find this overall twist just kind of lame. Again, to have a traitor lose the game because they were called out by this twist at the tail end of the game is, again, kind of a dumb ending. But also, if faithfuls end up confirming each other and end up being undyingly loyal to each other because of that and end up taking each other to two because of that, again, that's also a lame outcome as well. So I really don't like how the Seer was handled here. Again, it happening so late in the game in conjunction with the roles also not being confirmed, which, again, I like on paper. I just don't like it being utilized with this this twist, but also it being publicly revealed who the seer is and who they pick. And all this heavily skewing the game, which again, I don't like. Now again, I'm not fully against the seer twist entirely, as I do think it's an interesting premise, but again, I do feel like it should be unknown who gets the power, which would again stop a lot of these drawbacks of, but also I think it should happen earlier in the game. That way it doesn't end up becoming this defining feature of how this endgame ends up playing out. Again, I would not be opposed to seeing this seer back down the road, but I do think it needs a lot of tweaks in terms of little details of how it functions to become a twist that isn't like just too overpowered at the tail end here. But as for the mission itself, we do get a really convoluted challenge to determine who gets the seer, it having 3 rounds, taking elements from previous missions to where players end up getting money through each of these rounds, and the one with the most money by the end ends up getting the seer, which isn't revealed until after the banishment because the player with the most could get voted out and they obviously just want to add it in anyway. But also at that point, like, why not just tell them that, hey, if the person with the most gets voted out, it goes to second place? As again, it's kind of obvious that's what would happen. But again, this would end up being such a weird challenge. Again, round 1 had them having to pop balloons that clowns were holding, and if they get money, they keep it for their total, while otherwise they lose all their money, and again, you can decide on when to stop. Round 2 is similar, but instead of them getting the creepy dolls and have the choice on whether or not to pull the string, which would lead to the doll telling them how a certain amount of money they would get, or if they got greedy, to which again they would lose it all, which again was just so dumb, so arbitrary, that each of the players just randomly get these dolls and there's no set guideline on how many dolls have what amount. Again, it just feels so arbitrary, and it having just no skill here at all, where again, at least there was like memorization with the clowns. With this, again, they should have given out the odds here to, again, at least have a little bit of skill involved in this, instead of just making it pretty much entirely random. But then we get to the final round, which was essentially just redoing the coin collecting task with a lot of focus here over how disgusting it is. But again, it's like, who cares? But ultimately, we do end up seeing it narrowed down to Brittany, Danielle, or Dolores, who will end up having the seer, which is a pretty good draw for the Traitors here, with 2 of them in the top 3, though we do end up getting content from Dylan here, talking about how hard Danielle was fighting in the challenge, which seemed to spook Dylan here even more into thinking Danielle was a traitor, and that she's obviously being frantic to keep her cover, which again was a good call from him. And we do end up feeling even more resolute here in now having to make this move against Danielle to again avoid Danielle getting the seer, but also considering the fact that she has so many allies at this point in the game that would put her in a prime position just to steamroll the end game, where and she has Brittany and Dolores as numbers, which is why I do feel like Dylan's decision here to flip against Danielle ends up being the correct call. But again, we do get a lot of Brittany and Danielle trying to pin the vote on Gabby, though most of it ends up falling on deaf ears, with Dolores not committing to the vote and saying that she wants to hear what Gabby has to say first, clearly being more into the idea of voting for Ivar for some reason. But also we end up having Dylan seemingly playing into this Gabby vote until after the mission, to which at that point he ends up being clearly against it, even telling Danielle to her face that he's listening to all the info against her, where at this point there was just again just so much evidence against Danielle, and we do see that I think it would have been pretty hard to avoid unless you're Dolores, where again I think it was just such a big mistake here for her to be leaving Dylan in the game, someone that again is obviously smart enough to pick up on all this. But this does end up leading to a fun scramble here, with Brittany now trying to save Danielle, trying to pull over Dolores and Ivar, and failing to convince them of anything. But we do end up getting a pretty funny Brittany moment here of her frantically running around trying to find Ivar, not being able to do so. I did like here that we do see Brittany already setting up the reasons why she would vote with Danielle, despite knowing the evidence against her, by saying that she just can't do that to her, considering their previous relationship, which felt like a nice fail-safe for her. All while we do end up getting some fun content in this episode from Danielle, just walking into rooms with Gabby, leading to awkward silence between the two, where it's very clear the two are going after each other. Though it did make me question if Danielle here is doing this intentionally, if she's trying to do this like buddy system of trying to stick with Gabby just so that she can't campaign against Danielle, which, to be fair, I don't know how intentional that necessarily was, but I do think it's something that could work to your favor, especially considering the very limited amount of time that they have to campaign here. But anyway, we get to the round table, where we do end up seeing Brittany going for Gabby, which I will say does feel out of character for Brittany here, that she's starting to speak up out of the blue. But this ends up all being retorted by Gabby having a pretty strong rebuttal here, with Dylan and Ivar ending up backing her in this spot, making it clear the votes weren't going Danielle's way at this point, where even Dolores ends up voicing that she doesn't think it's Gabby, but does say that she's going to be voting for Ivar, which is a really interesting moment here, as we do end up seeing Danielle and Brittany obviously being shocked at this, though considering Dolores is a pretty integral vote for them, again a vote that essentially guarantees that they can at least go to a tie. I did love seeing them seemingly getting on the same page, despite them not being able to communicate, by them them both ending up switching their votes onto Ivar instead of Gabby to, again, at least get 3 votes against somebody. And again, in a world where Dylan is with them, that would allow them to win the day with a 3-2-1. Otherwise, it allows them to at least force a tie, which again, I think is the correct play if you're trying to save Danielle. I was happy to see both of them pick up on it. Feeling like something that only the gamers would be able to do in this spot. Though I will say, I do think it is a move that you could say is definitely questionable from Brittany. The fact that she switches her vote to Ivar, again, in this move to save Danielle, despite the fact that Brittany herself has said that she knows about all the evidence against Danielle, is definitely something that be suspicious about here. As why is she fighting so hard to keep Danielle when she knows that she's a traitor? But again, I was impressed with the fact that both of them were able to flip their votes in order to try to save Danielle here. So again, we obviously get to the vote reveal where it is revealed that Dylan did flip, and we do end up getting a 3-3 tie, which is very rare to see, especially this late into a season, with there being like these very defined sides, where again, this very much did feel more like a social strategy game than a social deduction game. And it is here where we actually do learn what the tiebreaker is, where we do learn that if they proceed to tie again, it will end up being decided by random draw, which I knew, though I always assumed that the random draw was going to be like on Survivor with rocks, where it'll be a random draw between those that were previously safe, with this again being a measure to try to force the players to actually make a decision. But here we actually learned that the rules here are actually the opposite. Again, the fact that the random draw here is actually between the people that were voted on, which doesn't give much incentive for the people outside that to flip their vote, outside of, again, the worried sus of the perception of being so steadfast in that decision. But again, I do think for something like the Traitors, this actually does make sense that it works this way. Again, it is a game about finding the traitors, and just making a random draw from everybody just actually does end up helping the traitors, as most people in the game are going to be faithful. So through that, again, you're obviously making it much more likely that a faithful ends up going home, but also it would be really lame for a traitor to be taken out by random draw, not because they were sussed out due to more social reasons. So while I do like Survivor tiebreaker for most social strategy games, I do think for something like the Traitors in particular, again, a social deduction game, I do think having this style of ruling makes a bit more sense. But here on the revote, we do end up spending a lot of time focused around Brittany's perspective, seeing her being unsure of what to do, and seeing her look at Dolores, who's shaking her head as she looks at Danielle, making it seem like Brittany thinks that this is a lost cause, to which we end up getting to the vote reveal, with Brittany being shocked when seeing Dolores' vote, and that Dolores ends up sticking with voting for Ivar, with us getting to the Brittany vote with, again, a lot of suspense here on did she switch her vote due to what she saw from Dolores, and we instead get a cliffhanger, which was lame, where, again, I've always hated these style of cliffhangers, as it really just saps momentum from the episode, though this obviously did have pretty major stakes here on how the endgame plays out, to where, again, I get why they would have wanted to drag this out into the finale, but again, I was fully expecting them to utilize the seer as this big cliffhanger instead of the vote result here. And by the time we get to the finale, it becomes very clear why they end up doing this, and that's because they had really nothing going for this finale, where the result here ends up essentially spoiling the rest of the season in a way that did shock me, where, again, I was actually fully expecting Danielle to survive this round. Mind you, again, there were spoilers out there that I did end up seeing that pointed to that, but even beyond that, I did feel like Danielle's edit felt like one that, again, would have made a lot more sense if she was screwed over by the seer twist, and that's the reason why they gave her such a negative portrayal. But instead, she just gets taken out here by Brittany flipping her vote, which is obviously a decision that ends up just greatly affecting the end of the season. I mean, it's one that, again, takes Danielle out of the game, obviously, but even beyond that, kind of ends up screwing Brittany over as well, where I think this was a pretty bad decision from Brittany. I think it's one that, again, you might as well cut your losses at that point and stick with Danielle, where, again, if things go wrong and Danielle does go out and Dolores does flip her vote, at least in that world, you can still claim that you stuck with her because of the fact that you had this pre-existing relationship. Again, it felt like that was kind of what she was setting up to do, to where, again, the fact that she kind of goes back on that betrays Danielle here and puts herself in the endgame position where she's now with a lot of people that don't really trust her. Again, that's not a good position to be in. Danielle stayed, which too, again, was not guaranteed anyway. Again, even if she voted with Danielle, obviously it would have been random chance between Danielle and Ivar. And again, there's obviously a chance that Danielle goes home there anyway. But again, in that world where Ivar does go home, Brittany essentially has the game won. She essentially has a near guaranteed win at that point, with, again, Danielle wanting to go to the end with her, Dolores being someone that is so blindly loyal to Danielle, Gabby as an easy person to pin the vote on at that point. And again, it just feels like such an easy path forward, where her flipping here, again, just essentially leaves her alone and with no true allies around her, which, again, I do think makes this move completely misguided and, again, very shocking from my perspective. We do end up seeing Danielle here be very bitter on her way out, talking about how you did it to me again, which again, funny that this entire storyline just leads to Brittany taking out Danielle again. But again, we do see Brittany saying, no, I didn't, and ends up being really emotional here, looking completely disheveled, even beyond the point where Danielle ends up revealing that she's a traitor, with her really not getting any joy from that reveal, which again, obviously is a tell there, along with the fact that Danielle also gives a big speech on her way out, thanking all of them except for Brittany. Again, clearly coming off it bitter at the fact that she voted for her, which again, I do think Brittany would have had a good argument here of just saying, oh, it was because of our big brother pass. But obviously, again, this is not a good look for Brittany. Definitely puts sauce on her. And I do think that's an aspect that's kind of lame. Again, as much as I do respect Danielle Reyes as a reality TV personality, I do think she kind of sunk the game for both of them even more in this spot, where this just all but dooms Brittany, where beyond this is just so much talk about how this is clear evidence that Brittany is a traitor, to where again, it kind of makes it very clear where we're headed for this entire finale. But with that elimination out of the way, let's stop down, talk about the boot, talk about Danielle Reyes. And again, Danielle Reyes is obviously someone that I know very well from Big Brother, and I was so excited to see her on the Traitors. I mean, she was such a perfect pick for this show, someone that has her legacy based around the fact that she was able to keep her alliance secret, and I feel like her skills are really suited to that of the Traitors. Mind you, she also plays a very sloppy game. And again, the edit really highlighted that, and I do think it's very strange just how the edit highlighted that. Again, and I felt like they really went out of their way to portray her negatively in a spot where I don't feel like that was completely necessary, and I guess they really wanted to hype her up as this villain that gets foiled at the end here. But again, I just feel like her portrayal on the show was just overtly negative in a way that didn't really make much sense to me, and obviously it leads to a lot of negativity surrounding Danielle in a spot where I do find it just very strange how much of the online community just seemed to hate Danielle following this season, where again, mind you, a lot of that seemed to come from an audience that simply did not know who Danielle was. But again, like, it does feel like there was so much of the audience that was very pro Carolyn and very anti Danielle, to the point where I think it just got kind of icky at just how much vitriol there was for Danielle, where again, I don't think Danielle does anything particularly wrong here. I mean, obviously you can have qualms with certain statements she said, but in terms of how she played the game and how she acted on this season, nothing there is really anything to completely demonize her for in the way that some portions of the online community did, where again, I did find the overall reaction to Danielle very strange, and I do think the edit is largely to blame for that and how negatively they portrayed her there. But still, I do feel like Danielle got a lot of unjustified hate from this season that again got a bit too extreme in my opinion. But again, for me personally, I was very excited to see Danielle Reyes here. I think she perfectly played into the role that I would have expected her to be in, and I felt like her role in this season really made this season. Again, I think she is why I do think once she leaves, again, the quality of the season definitely takes a major dip. But either way, let's continue on the finale, where we get the reveal that Brittany is the seer, which again, funny considering I just wanted this ramble about how overpowered a seer can be. In this spot, we see it have no effect on anything, as everyone just assumed Brittany was the traitor at this point, which again is very different from the other way I saw the seer play out in a certain other season. So again, at least it was kind of interesting in that light, but here we do end up seeing Brittany being separated from the others, to which we end up seeing the other four being gathered together in a waiting room, awaiting Brittany's decision, which I did think was a bit unfair. I mean, obviously this allows for the other four to really communicate without her and strategize without her, and we do see Dylan really making the most of this. Again, talking through all the situations with the other players, and it does seem like this is the point where these four really lock in the fact that they're going to stick together, that they all believe that all of them are faithfuls, which I do think is a weird circumstance here in the fact that it does seem like there was some sentiment about the notion that they could all be faithfuls, all five of them, as again, obviously they had eliminated a lot of traitors along the way. But through that, again, we're getting into this final five roundtable in a spot where some of the people did think that they were all faithfuls, and they're voting out somebody just because they kind of have to, which I do think is kind of a strange notion in the traitors, of being forced to vote someone out despite the fact that you think someone is faithful. But again, this ends up leading to Dylan using the concept of Danielle being bitter at Brittany to really end up turning the tables on Brittany here, where again, once this started to happen, I was like, we know the result. Brittany's probably a goner at this point. To where, again, it really made the rest of the finale just kind of boring and really just feeling like it's Brittany's last stand. Again, I just did not see actually working out for her. Now, I will say, with that said, I do think Brittany actually plays this year pretty well here. I think all things considered, I think she actually makes the optimal play here in selecting Gabby. Now, not to frame Gabby in the way that actually it seemed like Dylan was thinking that the seer was going to be utilized to do, but instead to clear Gabby. And through that, try to gain trust with Gabby and pick up Gabby as an ally, where it seemed like her plan was to really get all the women together and gang up on the men. And again, I feel like that was her play here. I think that was really her only path to survival in this falling round, especially considering how gung-ho Dylan seems to be against her. But again, I never truly felt like this was going to play to her favor, especially considering how we do get to see these conversations between Dylan, Ivar, and Dolores that made it pretty clear. I think those three were planning on sticking together through the following round and banishing one of either Brittany or Gabby, depending on what the results of the seer ended up being. But yeah, I think Brittany does as much as she can with the seer power here. It was really a spot where I think she was going to be sus no matter what. And really all this could have done is, again, just sinking Gabby along with her. She obviously could have theoretically tried to throw Gabby under a bus. Again, I just don't think that would have been effective here. As again, it really just becomes a spot where they're just going to take both of them out before the end. But anyway, we get to the breakfast where first we see the three come in that didn't have anything to do with the seer, and what do you know, they're planning on working together because obviously, again, I don't love the fact that these three in particular were given so much time on their own to talk. Again, it just makes it more likely they were going to actually stick together for a vote. But again, we do see a lot of assumptions that Brittany and Gabby are going to be accusing each other, which does leave them a bit shocked when Brittany does end up clearing Gabby as a faithful instead, which again does seem to throw Dylan off the scent for a bit. That is until he kind of comes out with this idea that maybe Brittany and Gabby are both traitors, where again, at this point, it really felt like the show just trying to use anything to just add suspense here in a spot where it was just so clear Brittany was going home, and also pretty clear that the remaining four did trust each other and also weren't the most like cutthroat players in the world, where again, I think the ultimate result here was not particularly shocking to try to add in all these like little bits of this person susses this person, even though none of that ended up ultimately mattering. But again, as I said, I think this is kind of just an unfortunate circumstance for Brittany, to where while this again does throw off some of the sus on her, to where it makes Dylan consider the fact that maybe there are no traitors at all at this point, it also is a spot where again they have to vote out somebody anyway. And through that, again, Brittany is still the most sus person no matter what she really does during this round, where again it just feels like she was kind of screwed by the fact that there was always just going to be a vote during this round. But also here again, we do get talk about sus on Dolores, which doesn't really go anywhere because there's no real evidence for that outside the concept of her being close to Danielle. But again, it should also be clear that she's still here because Danielle was a traitor. To where again, I personally feel like Dolores should be like the most clear person in this entire game. Yet for some reason, there's still some lingering sus on her. But again, we end up getting a very awkward conversation between Brittany and Dylan that does alert Brittany to the fact that Dylan is clearly on to her, leading to her deciding to go all out against Dylan during this round, which I will say, like, while she did probably have more proof for this than otherwise, I think I personally would have taken the shot at Ivar instead here. Again, it seemed like Dolores in particular did not trust Ivar, where Dylan was someone that was assumed to be a faithful for so long in the game. I feel like it would have been an easier argument to go for Ivar here instead. Though again, I do think she ends up putting together a pretty effective pitch against Dylan. But even in how she was pitching this, I did feel like it was pretty clear that this was just kind of out of character for Brittany in terms of how she reacted to things previously, going very aggressively against Dylan. Before we get to see that battle play out, we have to have the final mission of the season. Which, do I even bother talking about it? I mean, this was so boring. Where, like, for some reason, we have them, like, driving out to find the money, which was just so pointless. Like, obviously, they were going to find it. To which then they have to drive these cool cars back, even though they are not the ones driving them, and they're being driven back instead. And there's like a lot of like emphasis on how cool this is, when it's like, who cares? And we get to the actual final mission to reveal that what they actually have to do is instead dangle on a helicopter and drop the money into a ring of fire to double the amount of money they get, where it's like, I really don't care. And I don't even think they care that much about how much money they get. And I will say, like, this is something that will play a factor into the end game. And something that I do think is a major issue with the Traitors US in particular is how the money really does not matter. And I think it becomes abundantly more clear on this season than ever, and the fact that, again, we're in a world where this is a cast full of celebrities, people that are already rich, people that aren't in dire need of $200,000, which is what the ultimate prize ends up being. So through that, again, there's a less incentive to really backstab people to get like a sliver more of the prize pot, especially when a lot of these people are getting pretty big appearance fees to be getting on the season. So I think it's kind of ridiculous to think about the concept of Ivar, a British royal who hasn't had to care about money his entire life. He's somebody that cares about whether he gets 50,000 or 66,000. None of that really matters. I do think that ends up playing a pretty major factor into how this season plays out. But again, following this, we get the final pitches before the round table, where I think this is where it became even more clear the fact that Brittany was going home. The fact that we ended up having Brittany give this massive pitch to Dolores and Gabby, only for us to then proceed to see Dolores and Gabby talking to Dylan. And we end up seeing Dolores confronting Dylan, saying, "You better not vote me out." Where, again, it just felt very clear that this was just already a prearranged pact, that Dolores had already decided that she was going with Dylan. This is simply just her trying to make sure that Dylan sticks to his word, where, again, it just made no logical sense based on the footage that we're seeing that Brittany would ultimately end up winning this battle. And we do see her admirably face off against Dylan at the round table, her going way more aggressively than I think Dylan ever expected. But even in a spot where, again, I think to Brittany, it should have been pretty clear that she was probably going home here. And I think that's probably why she went as aggressively as she did. And calling out Dylan for being close to Danielle having also a big reaction to Dylan voting her out. So again, I think those are good arguments. I think the problem is the fact that, as Brittany states herself, that those are also arguments against her, where she's essentially just saying that Dylan has the same negatives as me, to where at that point it's like, well, they're just going to vote you out and then maybe vote out Dylan following that. But again, I think you're in a spot where it's very unlikely you're going to stay. And to be fair, I mean, Brittany did also add into her campaign to Dolores and Gabby that you need to keep me in, as Dylan won't take you to the end. And again, that's fair if someone like Dolores was ever thinking about the game that strategically. But again, we do get some fun moments from Brittany here, particularly in Ivar, like calling her meek, only for Brittany to say back to him, "Do I seem meek to you?" Which I did actually find funny that Ivar's response to this was essentially just yes. But again, Brittany does come off very aggressive here, to the point where we do see Dylan just like kind of cowering down, but again, we just see him being like just genuinely surprised at how hard she's going for him, which too fair, I think is also probably like a bit of overconfidence from him, in the fact that he probably thought he had the game won at this point. And it's like at least adds some doubt here, and the fact that obviously this does get Gabby and Dolores's head spinning, and maybe Dylan actually is a traitor, but ultimately, obviously, it doesn't really matter. We get to the vote, and it's a 4-1 vote, with Dolores saying for the first time she's voting with her brain. Which, I mean, to be fair to her, obviously it works out for her. And obviously there is more proof for Brittany being a traitor than Dylan, though I do think in most given situations the move actually would have been to keep Brittany, take out Dylan, considering, again, in most worlds, someone like Dylan would not just end the game at Final Four. And Dylan, someone that is very unlikely to take Dolores to the tail end, while Brittany's like kind of a shield for her moving forward. But obviously, again, that doesn't really matter. But ultimately, again, we end up seeing Brittany being banished here, and also proceeding to not reveal her identity, which that aspect of this season did not really play out how I was expecting, where obviously, as I mentioned before, typically this style of format would lead to people feeling the need to go down to 2, yet instead, this doesn't happen, where, to be fair, it's a very weird circumstance in the fact that, like, really everyone thought everybody was clear, which I think you were very rarely going to get. It is funny how, like, we had these, like, major change-ups to the endgame format here, again, the addition of the Seer, the addition of not revealing your identity, and neither of them actually played any factor into this season. But again, with that, we lose Brittany, and again, I was very sad to lose Brittany in this spot. I mean, Brittany is someone that I was really hoping was going to get her reality TV win, and obviously with the elimination of Brittany, we're now left with 4 non-gamers at the end, which I think is kind of a lackluster ending considering how prominent the gamers were on this season. I mean, the fact that all the major traitors of this season were Survivor and Big Brother players, and for none of them to even make the final fire was, again, very disappointing to see, especially considering I did have high hopes for Brittany coming into this finale. I did feel like a Brittany win was probably the most likely result of this season from an editing perspective, yet again, it really just all crumbles once we see that vote for Danielle, and from that point forward, it just became abundantly clear Brittany was on her way out, with just no one really trusting her, which, again, I think is a sad way to see her arc end here. Though, again, I thought Brittany was still fun on this season, and while she was, again, very quiet in the edit through the first half, I did feel like once her edit started to spring up, I feel like she ended up being a pretty entertaining presence, and someone that I did think was a pretty perfect pick for the Traitors, and someone that, again, came relatively close to pulling it off here. But with that, again, we get to the final fire, where, again, it was just boring. I mean, we get so much set up to it, where we see Alan interviewing the Final Four, and a lot of talk about how, do you think anyone's a traitor or not, and no one really giving a super solid answer. Again, this was just such a foregone conclusion at this point, especially considering the very small amount of time left in the episode. So for me, there was no doubt that this season was going to end with everybody just voting to end the game right away. In a spot where, again, obviously we know everyone left is a faithful, so we're just getting a boring faithful win, which I think is just, again, very lame and a very sad ending to this season. To where, again, I think up to this point, this was by far the best Traitors US season. And I still think it is still the best Traitors US season, but this does end up being a bit of a ding against it. Again, the fact that the ending here is just so lackluster, the fact that it's 4 people getting to the end, just instantly ending the game in a spot where they're all faithful. I think it's pretty much like the worst case scenario from production standpoint, where there's just very little intrigue in how this plays out. Where, again, to me, as I mentioned before, with the money, it just feels like they're not really incentivized to be continuing to vote people out. Where, again, we see Gabby talk about like not wanting to be greedy. We see Dolores and Ivar talking about wanting to be honorable. So where, again, I just think this is a lame ending, especially considering the fact that this means that all 4 of these people win in this spot where, again, obviously Dylan and Gabby winning, I think is perfectly fine. Again, Dylan is somebody that I think probably played one of the best faithful games in the history of the Traitors. For a while, again, I question if certain things were intentional. I think he played the game very well. Gabby is someone that was a very fun presence on the show, to where I think her winning this season was also satisfying. But then we get Ivar and Dolores winning after being such duds on this season. Ivar brought nothing to the show, was barely even on the show, to where, again, that was actually probably the thing that shocked me the most about this finale, is the fact that I fully expected Ivar to be going when Danielle went, simply because he was just barely on the show. I generally didn't think that they would give somebody such a quiet edit that went on to win the show, while someone like Dolores is just someone that we constantly see being wrong, and is constantly wrong across the season, to where, and seeing Dolores and Ivar ending up winning this season, which is kind of a shame, in my opinion, is something that does kind of drag the season down a bit. Where, again, if it was just a Dylan Gabby faithful win, I feel like that would have been a much more satisfying outcome to this season. But again, with the tag-alongs of Ivar and Dolores, it just makes this just kind of dull. And I'll also, again, question, like, why did they just end the game here in a spot where they also get like a pathetically small prize here of $50,000 each, like less than what the runner-up on Big Brother makes at this point? And that is just so pathetic. While ultimately, again, it doesn't really matter how much money they make. I think the fact that like a show of the prestige of the Traitors, something that has like all these like massive names from the reality sphere coming together for one massive season, the fact that they ultimately end up giving away $50,000 each that are winners is just so funny. So again, I just thought this was a very lackluster way to end the season. Now, I will mention the fact that we also obviously got a reunion show, one that I thought was just kind of fine. I didn't think it was like necessarily like boring, but also I felt like not much of this came off particularly notable. I mean, we did get some fights along the way. I mean, we did see some fights between the Traitors, again, Carolyn versus Danielle. We got Brittany versus Danielle. I was surprised to see them openly talking about the fact that there was like the online rumor about how Danielle had leaked the fact that she was a traitor to Brittany, which again just gets shut down here. And also something I think would have been very out of character for someone like Danielle to do that anyway. But we also get like Bob the drag queen getting a lot of heat from the housewives, which was funny. But really outside that, again, not too much notable here. Actually, a lot more tame than I was expecting, considering it did seem like there was a lot of vitriol against Danielle coming into this reunion, to where we don't actually end up seeing a lot of that really play out. It doesn't feel like there was that much bitterness there, to where, again, outside of her conversation with Carolyn, which even then I felt like Danielle actually came off pretty well throughout this reunion. I feel like she was very willing to admit when she messed up and really took a lot of this as the game, to where, again, I think Danielle overall pretty good look for her, and really, again, just a reunion that just ends up not being super notable by the end. And with that, let's talk about the winners of the season, starting off with Dolores, who is a dud. I thought she was so boring. And it's funny considering they really propped her up in the reunion show as like, oh, the first ever Real Housewife to win the show. I do think she's somebody that had just such terrible reach throughout a lot of the season. To be fair to her, I will say, like, at least she did actually spec Bob the drag queen early on. I mean, at least that's something. But beyond that, again, she was just kind of completely aloof for a lot of the rest of the game. She was in a spot where I feel like she was set to go to the end with Danielle and lose against her, had Brittany not switched her vote at the last second, which again is completely something not in Dolores' control, even though, again, funnily, it was because of Dolores' glance that caused that, but again, it's obviously not intentional from Dolores. And again, Dolores, someone that also was just kind of boring for TV show. I don't think she really brought much entertainment here. So again, I find the fact that she ends up ultimately winning after playing the game pretty terribly for the majority of it just kind of underwhelming. But to be fair, I think that's also just kind of an aspect of the Traitors that, again, it's not a game like Survivor or Big Brother where you need this respect at the end to ultimately win. Again, this is a game where you can just stumble your way to the end and kind of just make a final decision that's to your benefit and ultimately win because of that. And that's kind of what ends up happening with Dolores here. beyond that, we move on to Dylan, who, again, as I said, I think is probably one of the best faithfuls in history of the show. I think he played an incredible game on this season. One that had him being a masterful detective towards the end game, pretty much being right on everything from the Carolyn round on. Now, I will say, I do think he was a bit snowed by Rob at points in this season. I do think there was a world where had Rob somehow not been taken out, I think he would have actually gone to the end and lost against Rob, to where him himself also had to kind of get saved from his own initial instinct. But I do think Dylan is someone that, again, does come off as a very strong player here. One that, again, was a good detective when he needed to be. Someone that, again, I don't know if he did this intentionally, but was able to befriend a lot of the people that ultimately became the traitors, which, again, I do think is the ultimate strat, which, again, I do think is the optimal strat for down the road, is to befriend the gamers, assuming that they likely are going to be traitors. And also, again, was able to build a group around him, and was able to secure this trust to the point where everyone just ends the game at Final Four, which is insane. To where, again, I do think Dylan is someone that I would very much assess pretty highly if I were to ever do a top 10 faithful ranking. But beyond that, again, was kind of fun on the show. I know there's a lot of people kind of swooning over Dylan Efron online, and again, he's a very likable presence here, but not someone that's the most riveting TV. I think he's also someone that's, again, probably a little bit too honor bound for my taste, where I do think he, again, played a perfect role in the Traitors. I think this was kind of the perfect show for him, but I do think if he were to go on to do other shows, which obviously I'm expecting him to do at this point, I don't know how riveting of TV he's going to be on there, but again, I do think for this one appearance, he ends up obviously being a major standout from this season. And with that, we then move on to Gabby, who is someone that, again, I also knew nothing about Gabby coming in this season, and I come out of this season, again, thinking Gabby's an incredible character. I mean, Gabby was really fun in the confessional, had a really fun energy, where you see people compare her to like a younger Jennifer Coolidge, and I could definitely see that. Also someone that, again, was decent at the game, again, had some decent reads at points. Now, to be fair, I mean, she herself was sus at points, and I do think she actually gets greatly benefited from the fact that Brittany ends up using the seer on her, where I think that really ends up quelling a lot of the sus on her, where had that not happened, I do think there would have at least been more of a chance that they do end up voting out Gabby before ending the game. But I still think Gabby is someone that, again, played a fine enough game throughout most of the season, was able to argue her case pretty well when confronted, and again, just overall a pretty solid player while also being a fun character, and someone that I do think is a very satisfying winner for the season. And to finish the video off, let's talk about Ivar. Was he even on this season? Like, Ivar, again, was just such a dud to me. I can't believe we're leaving this season looking at Ivar as a winner, to where, as gobsmacked as it was that Dolores ended up winning this season, I'm even more surprised the fact that Ivar's winning this season, to where, well, practically, again, it was always in the cards. I just feel like, edit-wise, again, like, the fact that they just gave him nothing on the show is so shocking that this person ends up ultimately winning. Considering it felt like even the edit knew how boring he was and was playing that up. The fact that we even got that segment from, like, Gabby not even knowing he was in the room, and again, it just feels like Ivar is such a joke on this season, but again, not in a fun way, not in the way that like Tom Sandoval's a joke, but more so a joke in the fact that he is just such a dud that the show had to make fun of just how much of a dud he is. Now, with that said though, Ivar isn't that bad of a player. I mean, I think Ivar, again, while he brought nothing to the show, I think actually did show himself to have, again, good reads at points. Seemed to have a grouping that did trust him, mind you, again, also. Did have people like Dolores suspecting him for really most of the season. That's still an issue. But again, I think Ivar is actually, like, again, a decent enough player. And one that, again, I'm shocked wasn't murdered along the way, but also somebody that, again, he couldn't do it for little flair. He couldn't be at least like somewhat interesting on the show. He can just not be a dud. So again, Ivar just did nothing for me, and I just can't believe we're leaving this season with him as a winner. But again, with that, that's the entire season of the Traitors, season 3. A season that, again, I still really like the season at the end of the day. I think it's a season that had a really fun ride. Really, every episode up until the finale was a pretty fun episode of the show. Now, again, I think the finale, again, was bad. I do think it is something that does, again, minorly taint the season, but you still do leave this season thinking of this as one of the best Traitor seasons. I think it is definitely the best of the US seasons, like not particularly close to me. And I do think, again, it would have been in that true upper echelon worldwide had it not been for this kind of lackluster conclusion to the season. So while the outcome here is something that, again, like we've never seen before, it's also something that I never needed to ever see. And while, again, I think the like Gabby Dylan win of it all is something that's very tolerable, I think the fact that it expands to Dolores and Ivar is just something that is, again, kind of egregious. But again, the season did still have a lot of fun moments, a lot of fun fights at the round table, and a lot of fun rivalries. To where, again, I think it's a season that will have a lot of notable moments for me when thinking about the season down the road. I just wish it wasn't kind of tainted by the fact that its outcome is just kind of underwhelming. But with, again, those are my thoughts on the Traitors US Season 3. Down the road, obviously, we know Season 4 is filming pretty soon. Obviously, I'll be doing a cast reaction to that cast when we see it, and obviously a review of that season whenever it ends up airing, and really for any other Traitors US season, as I guess I'm all in on covering Traitors US at least. Again, very unlikely to go beyond this, considering, and I barely have time to even cover Traitors US, but again, I feel like Traitors US is obviously big enough, and obviously I have enough connection to a lot of the players that are on it to where, again, it's worth continuing on with. Now, beyond that, obviously, we got a lot of shows currently airing, and we got Australian Survivor Brains Rebrawn 2, which, again, I'll obviously continue covering. I mean, the mid-season power ranking for that should be this coming week, which I'll be trying to get out on time. Also, there's a chance it doesn't, but again, I'll at least try. Beyond that, obviously, we do have Challenge All-Star Rivals, which as of right now, I'm still planning on covering, but we'll see. And I'll definitely obviously be covering Survivor 48 and Amazing Race 37 when those conclude, so stay tuned for videos on all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.